You're listening to the Bible Uncut and Unfiltered. We believe the Bible doesn't need to be watered down or cleaned up to be understood. Our goal is to provide a healing place to discuss the questions you can't ask and the context you won't learn in church. I'm your host, Colin Connor. Now, on to the episode. Have you ever wished we could go back in time to the good old days? A simpler time when life looked more like Leave It to Beaver. I think just about everyone experiences a sense of nostalgia at some point in their life. A feeling where they wish they could go back to the way things used to be. Perhaps you even think we should try to return back to those times, change the way our world works now to get back to the days before things were so complicated and difficult. While that is certainly a common notion, and even a valid feeling, Qoheleth tells us in this chapter that it is not wise to try to return to the perceived glory days of the past. In fact, he says it is foolishness to pine over the bygone eras yesteryear. Find out why, and so much more this week, coming up. Last week's episode ended on a verse where Qoheleth says that no one can know what is good in life. He asked, who knows what is actually good for a human in this life? Now, in this chapter, he kind of attempts to answer that question. It was a hypothetical, it was a rhetorical question, but he still tries to wrestle with it. And that's really been the way this whole book has worked, right? He basically says, there's no way you can figure out all the answers. Here's how I tried to figure out all the answers. I didn't figure out any answers. Here's the stuff I figured out. And it's just kind of this repeating circle of thought after thought throughout this book where he's trying to get at something that is just barely out of reach. He says it is out of reach, but then tries to tell us what he learned along the way. I think this is a really good example of something called epistemic humility. I know that's a fancy philosophical term, but epistemic comes from the root word of epistemology, which would be a study of knowledge or what we can know. And so epistemic humility is the idea that we should be humble about what we think we know, because in reality there is actually very little that we know, and at the end of the day, it is always possible that we actually know nothing, that everything we think we have gotten right in life is wrong. This is a very important principle that I think a lot of Christians miss out on, and particularly public speaking Christians like pastors, preachers, evangelists, authors, sometimes even podcasters. We miss out on the idea that we might not have everything figured out. In fact, we might not have anything figured out. It's very easy when you have a platform in front of other people to assume that your job is to look like you know everything. Like, people are coming to me for information, so I should look like I have information. If I look like I don't know what I'm talking about, they're going to go somewhere else. It is a temptation for pretty much every public speaker. But what a lot of people don't realize is that people are smart, and they know that you don't know everything. Whether or not you realize it, everybody else knows that you don't know everything. So if you act like you do, people are going to find out that you don't. And at that point, you lose trust. It is not the lack of knowledge that causes someone to lose trust. It is when you put yourself up as knowing more than you actually do, or like you're an expert in a field that you're actually not, and then people start to realize that you have misled them. That's when trust breaks down. That's why it's so important to have this epistemic humility, this honest acknowledgement that I don't know everything, and even the stuff that I do know, it's possible I'm wrong on, because I've been wrong on stuff before, and I've had to change my opinion. I've had to admit that I've been wrong. I've had to change my mind. If you run into somebody who has never changed their opinion on something, you have run into somebody who hasn't grown and who probably doesn't actually know what they're talking about. It is the people who talk the loudest who often understand the least. And we're actually going to get into that idea a little bit more later on in the episode today. But that's why we focus so much here on this podcast on acknowledging there's more than one right way to go about this. That's why when we do the Q&R episodes, they're Q&R and not Q&A. I don't want you to think I am offering you the Christian answer for anything. I am giving you a Christian response to this. That's why we do question response, not question and answer. So I think Qoheleth is actually being a good example of epistemic humility here, and it's frustrating because we like solid black and white answers. We like being able to come, especially to something like the Bible, and get an easy takeaway for the day. But with Qoheleth, we keep getting this circular pattern of thought. If you've realized now that we're past the halfway point in this book, a lot of themes have been repeating. We have covered the same topic from multiple angles multiple times now. And I think that's very purposeful because he's trying to work this out. And if you've ever actually wrestled with what you believe on something, not just said this is why I believe, but actually tried to get down to why do I believe this? And especially if you've ever had to deconstruct a belief or a belief system, you can probably relate to the way that Qoheleth has been talking, because sometimes he seems to contradict himself. Sometimes he seems to be more traditional, other times he seems to be more unorthodox. And it's like, well, which one are you? Can you just land in a camp? Well, if you've ever worked through what you believe, you can relate to that. I know I can, where there are times that I catch myself using language that I might have agreed with 5 years ago, but I don't so much anymore. But it's still there in my mind because it was ingrained from so many years of thinking that way. And so I think we see this in him where he's basically giving us a peek behind the curtain at his thought process. It would be really easy for him to put the entirety of Ecclesiastes in just like 2 chapters and summarize the whole thing. Heck, you could probably do it in 1 chapter and just say, here's what I figured out in life. But instead, he takes us on the journey of his thought process so that those of us who are also on a journey of what we believe, which should actually be all of us, can relate to what he's saying, and we can see the highs and lows, we can see the back and forth, the ebb and flow, the times when he seems a little more traditional, the times when he seems a little more unorthodox, and it gives us permission to have that inconsistency. Now, I'm not saying that being inconsistent is a good thing, but whenever we work through our beliefs, we will be inconsistent at some point because we're figuring things out. And that's okay as long as you acknowledge it. And you're saying, look, I realize that I'm saying X here and I'm saying Y here. I know that's a contradiction and I'm still trying to figure out exactly how that works. There was actually a professor I had at college one time that acknowledged that. And I think he was like the first person that I ever remember saying that. And I thought that was really cool. Now, I disagreed with him on a lot of other stuff, but I liked how he presented it that one time where he's like, look, this is what I believe. If you come at it from this angle, I realize this is a contradiction in my belief system, but it's just the way I've worked it out to this point, and I'm okay with that right now. Like, I'm kind of okay with that as long as you're willing to acknowledge it. It's just the fact that a lot of people go through life without realizing the contradictions in their own belief systems. So keep this in mind as we go through the chapter today, that it's important for us to approach, honestly, I would say everything in life with a sense of epistemic humility. I don't know everything, and I probably don't even know as much as I think I know. So it's worth proceeding with humility. Now, as we get into this chapter, this is a strange chapter, at least compared to what we've had so far in Ecclesiastes. We have definitely had these cycles of patterns, and we've had times that are difficult to understand exactly what discernible pattern there is. Like, why did you put this thought next to that thought? It doesn't always flow linearly. But this chapter actually starts to look a lot more like the book of Proverbs than what we've had so far in Ecclesiastes. There's a lot of short, pithy sayings that don't always seem to have a connection, but commentators fight over this. Some think it's just a random assortment of wisdom that he has collected over his life so far. Others say there is actually a flow of thought here. And Brown in the interpretation commentary tried to put together somewhat of a theme, a string of themes for what he thinks Qoheleth is talking about in this chapter. And he says that the first several proverbs are going to deal with the topic of death, and specifically mourning and sorrow. And then verse 4 is going to, he says, introduce the morally exclusive categories of the wise and foolish, something that then continues to verse 7. Similarly, verse 8 serves as a transition into the next group of proverbs by echoing the sentiment of verse 1b and commending certain aspects of wise living that are developed in verses 8 through 12. These terse observations and exhortations conclude with two prose commands, so not poetry, but prose, that direct the reader to God's ordering of life, verses 13 to 14. Together, verses 1 through 14 serve to instruct the reader of his or her true humanity within the world of vanity. End quote. That's about as good of a system for this chapter that I have found so far, so we'll go with that. Now, I have noticed that these 14 verses together form a unit, and there's a little bit of what you might call an inclusio at the start and the end. I don't remember which commentary this was in, but I saw a couple of people bring this up, where you have all of these better than verses in this chapter. You have sorrow is better than laughter, the rebuke of the wise is better than the song of fools, the end of a thing is better than the beginning of it. So you have all of these better than statements. And in Hebrew, that word better is actually just going to be the word good. There isn't really a word for better in Hebrew, so you get this really funny sounding, at least in English, idiom where to say something is better in Hebrew, you say it is good from something. So let's see, if I were to say that eating vegetables is better than eating candy in Hebrew, I would probably end up having to say something along the lines of eating vegetables is good from eating candy. And that's how you would say that it is better than that. So you have this word good, which we've seen several times in the podcast so far. Just go back to our series in Genesis 1 through 11 for some more info on that. But that idea of good versus evil, with the tree of the knowing of good and evil, or as we'd say, the tree of the discerning of good and not good, those themes pop up again a lot in the Bible's wisdom literature, which is right where we're at in the middle of here in Ecclesiastes. So we can expect this word good to show up a lot. And it does. And verse 1 gives us good right at the beginning. Tov, a good name, is better than precious ointment, in the day of death than the day of one's birth. So it sets up this pattern of good and day, or Tov and Yom in Hebrew. And then when you get down to verses 10 and 14, it actually flips the order and puts Yom first and then Tov. So in verse 10 it talks about the former days being better, so that's day, Yom, and better again being good, Tov. Verse 14, the day of prosperity be joyful, and that word joyful is the word Tov again. So in verse 1 we have Tov and then Yom. In verses 10 and 14 we have Yom and then Tov. So it just kind of flips it. It's amazing, this poetry that's built into the Bible. You say, what's the practical application of that? There isn't one. It's just artistically beautiful. And a lot of pastors and preachers won't tell you that stuff. Number one, I think because they just don't know it. Most pastors and preachers are not actually trained in good Bible study. They are taught how to preach effectively and maybe how to run a business, but they're not really taught the culture of the Bible or the genre and how to draw these things out. So honestly, if you listen to this podcast, you're getting better Bible training than most Bible colleges give pastors and preachers. And I don't say that to say that we are the best that there is out there. What I mean is that Bible colleges really need to step up their game and start focusing on the right stuff when they're training the next generation of preachers. Because while this may not be a practical take home, and I think that this is the second reason why a lot of preachers don't tell you this kind of stuff, is because it's not practical. They're looking for something that you can take home and apply. But when you reduce the Bible down to just a bunch of aphorisms that you can take home, there are little calendars you can buy at the store that give you a moral for the day, or a quote for the day, or a proverb for the day, or some sort of motivational quote for the day. Like, that's not all the Bible is. And when we reduce it to that, we miss out on this beauty. I think so many people are just looking to the Bible for what am I supposed to do today, almost like a magical 8-ball, instead of stopping and going, this is like reading Shakespeare, but 1,000 times better. The artistry built into the text is mind-boggling, and it's worth taking the time to pause and recognize it, because then I think we get a better appreciation for the text. We realize that what we're doing is literary criticism. We are studying a work of literature, a work of art, and trying to understand it. So if you've ever wondered, why do I focus on stuff like that? That's why. Moving on. This chapter is going to be kind of difficult to interpret, and part of the reason for that is that commentators can't agree on why Qoheleth shares these proverbs. Some thinks he's presenting them at face value. Just, here's a proverb, it's a good one. Follow it, or take application from it. Others think that he's holding up the proverb for scrutiny and suggesting that the conventional wisdom actually falls short. So they are suggesting he actually means to teach the opposite of what that conventional proverb says. And so you can see how this leads to a difficulty. We have two different schools of thought here, and they're actually suggesting totally opposite things. Let me give you an example of maybe how this makes a little sense in common English proverbs. We could say, birds of a feather flock together. And I might say that just to say it as true. Sometimes it's good to be around people who think similar to you, have similar likes, whatever. It can be true. Or I could be presenting that to say, is that actually always true? And sometimes it's not. Sometimes it's better to have people with a different point of view so that we can see things from another angle. That's why we also have the proverb, opposites attract. Well, which one is true? Is it that birds of a feather flock together or opposites attract? Well, it's going to depend on the situation. So it's quite possible that in some of these circumstances, Qoheleth is actually giving us common proverbs of his day. Like, there is nothing that suggests he came up with these. It's quite possible that this is like a Poor Richard's Almanac. Ben Franklin didn't necessarily write all of those aphorisms. It's more likely that he just collected them. So same thing with Qoheleth here. It's quite possible he's just collecting common proverbs of his day. But then, is he presenting them favorably, or is he putting them up for scrutiny? This is really going to play big time at the end of the chapter. So keep this thought in the back of your mind. It's going to come up at the very end as being crucial to understanding those last few verses. And I like how Brown in the interpretation commentary said, "The sage has dragged conventional wisdom kicking and screaming into the realm of the absurd. His warrant for doing so is the topsy-turvy nature of human existence, in which death, not life, is the measure of all things." I mean, I love that quote. I feel like that's a perfect encapsulation of what Ecclesiastes has been all about. Qoheleth is trying to take our points of view and drag them kicking and screaming to their absurd ends. We tend to believe things and just stop where we're comfortable. But if we actually follow our beliefs out to a logical end, sometimes they start to fall apart. And we don't do that because we don't like our beliefs to fall apart. We don't like the idea that we could actually be wrong. But by pushing them that way, by forcing us to consider that, Qoheleth is refining our beliefs. He's not necessarily saying you have to change everything you believe, throw out everything, but he is suggesting maybe we need to take a second look and chip away some imperfections in our belief system. And Brown very astutely notes that much of this for Qoheleth revolves around focusing on death instead of focusing on life, so that you can actually focus on life better. Qoheleth believes that you can't really start to live life until you have come to grips with death. And that seems counter for a lot of people. We spend our whole lives trying to avoid death. We have medications and vaccines and home remedies and health food now and anti-aging products. We even have laws that try to extend life, like having to wear a seatbelt in a car now. All of this just to try to avoid death, and often to try to avoid even thinking about death and our slow march toward it. And yet Qoheleth says that's not living. That's just trying to ignore the inevitable. So if you can acknowledge that it's coming, if you can face it long before it shows up, you can actually enjoy the time you have until then. And go figure, that's going to come up again in the next few verses here. But looking just at the first one, he says, "A good name is better than precious ointment, and the day of death than the day of one's birth." Now, the first part there is a play on words in Hebrew, because the Hebrew word for name is Shem, and the Hebrew word for oil is Shemem. So we have Tov Shem, Mishemem Tov. So you can hear the similarity there in those words and how he's basically making a pun out of that phrase. Now, last week we talked a lot about riches and wealth and money, and he's still, in essence, talking about that here, because you needed to be extremely wealthy in the ancient world to own perfume. Today, you can just buy Axe or Old Spice or what have you, at Walmart, or you can even buy a decent bottle of cologne for 50 to $100. But in the ancient world, the average person wasn't wearing cologne or perfume. In fact, it's kind of crazy to think about if we could just be time traveled right back, transported into the ancient world. This is something that there's another great podcast out there called Biblical Time Machine. I think they've only been around for a little over a year, but they cover some incredible stuff on the ancient context of the Bible. So a little plug for them there. But they've talked about this before, where they say, if you could just get in a time machine and transport back to the time of the Bible, you would just about keel over dead within 2 days, because you have so many different diseases and viruses and bacteria that we're not used to over a couple thousand years. And the smell alone would come close to killing you, because people didn't normally bathe that much. They didn't have, body spray or deodorant. They didn't have dental care, all this stuff. There's so much that we just take for granted in our modern world that was only the privilege of the very wealthy in the ancient world. Now, in the second half of the verse here, Qoheleth says something that can be a little difficult to come to grips with. He says, the day of your death is better than the day of your birth. Now, we celebrate birthdays, we celebrate when a new child is born, and we usually mourn when someone dies. I mean, I guess it depends on the person, right? You might end up singing Ding Dong, the Wicked Witch is Dead. But normally, we celebrate at birth and mourn at death. And he's saying that it should actually be the other way around. Why is that? Well, there's a couple different ways you can look at this. One is that if you tie it to this idea of a name, you don't actually have your reputation established until after you're dead. Until the very last day of your life, you can continue to change your reputation. You can go for 70 years with a good reputation and then just be an absolute jerk of a person the last year of your life to everybody, and people are only going to remember you as that grumpy old miser, right? So that is one way of looking at it, is that in the day of death, you can no longer do anything to ruin your reputation. Now, I get what that's saying, but it's actually not true. And especially today, in the era of Me Too and the internet, where we are able to learn more about people than maybe we even want to know, it's possible for somebody to have a decent reputation in life, but to find out then after they've died that they weren't as good of a person as we thought they were. And a classic example of this, unfortunately, is Ravi Zacharias. He's a very popular Christian author that passed away, I think, probably about 5 years ago now or so, and a lot of people thought very favorably of him. And then after he dies, we find out that there was a lot of questionable activity going on, even sexual abuse. So if you take this to mean that your reputation is solidified once you've died, well, that's not necessarily true. And that can still be an okay interpretation, because remember, these are proverbs. They are not promises. They are not absolute statements about the way things always will be in life. So it is possible for this to only be accurate to a point. And that's okay. But I think a better way of looking at it that fits more with what Qoheleth has said so far is that in the day of death, you finally have rest. When you are born, you have a whole life ahead of you that is going to have all kinds of ups and downs. And yeah, it's going to have high points, but it's also going to have some really, really low points. And Qoheleth has been trying to get us to come to grips with that. So I think he's focused so much on that to say that the day of birth isn't as good as the day of death, because in the day of death you finally have rest from the hevel, from the toil, from the labor, from the reat ruon, the striving after win, the vexation of spirit, as the old King James says. The New Interpreter's Bible commentary says, the appropriate way to approach life then is with realism, sobriety, and a low profile. Now, a couple commentators have noticed here a similarity to another ancient text from roughly around the same time, probably a couple hundred years later, but it's an apocryphal text, so depending on what tradition you come from, it may be in your Bible, particularly in a Catholic or maybe Eastern Orthodox type tradition. It's called the Wisdom of Sirach. Sometimes it's called the Wisdom of Jesus, son of Sirach. Sometimes it's even called Ecclesiasticus. Now, not Ecclesiastes, but Ecclesiasticus. The similarity there is because we often call this Ecclesiastes in English because of the Greek word for Qoheleth, where it was translated into this, instead of assembler word, more of like a preacher or somebody who speaks in front of people, which is tied to the Greek word for a gathering, which would be the ecclesia, which is often translated church. So Ecclesiasticus was a book that was often read in church because it's very similar to Proverbs. It has a lot of easy to read aphorisms. It's a lot like this chapter. They are unrelated texts, and when it's called the wisdom of Jesus, son of Sirach, that is not the Jesus that we focus on as Christians. This was another person named Yeshua from roughly around 200 years before the Jesus of the New Testament. So all just coincidental stuff there. But there's a text in Sirach 11:28 that says, "Call no one happy before death. By how he ends, a person is known." So you can see some similarity there. That this isn't even necessarily saying that Ben Sirach took the words from Ecclesiastes, but it could just be a very common proverb of the day, and so both of them ended up quoting something similar. Shapiro in Ecclesiastes Annotated and Explained notes, "Part of the reason the day of death is better is because it finally cements your legacy. You spend your whole life building up to that point, but you have never fully established your good name until you're dead. While this sentiment is somewhat valid, it's also possible for matters to come to light after your death that change the way you're viewed." That's what we were just talking about. But he says your reputation or your name is determined by the sum of the choices you make and the actions you take, and this cannot be known until you die. Now, the next verse, Qoheleth says, "It's better to go to the house of mourning than to the house of feasting." And basically, we could compare that to a party versus a funeral. It says, "For this is the end of all people, and the living will lay it to heart." Why is it better to go to a funeral than a party? Well, because we're all eventually going to end up at a funeral. No matter how many parties you're going to go to, eventually a funeral is going to end your life. So the living would do well to learn from the dead so that they can live better now. Shapiro again says, "Thus it is more advantageous to visit a house of mourning than a house of feasting, for death is our common end, and only a heart at home with death truly lives." I really like how he worded that. Interestingly enough, this language is kind of the flip of what Proverbs talked about. Throughout Proverbs, there's this character of Lady Wisdom, who has the way of life, and then there is an antagonist that you could call Lady Folly, or some people say Dame Folly because she's not depicted as a lady there. She's depicted more as a seductress that is trying to take you off of the path of life. So Proverbs presents this, it's often called a strange woman. The idea is a foreign woman, someone who is not Jewish. They're trying to take you away from your Jewish heritage as someone listening to the speaker in Proverbs. This strange woman's house in Proverbs is depicted as the way to death, and wisdom, conversely, as the way to life. But Qoheleth inverts that imagery to suggest that the wise actually appreciate the way of death, and the foolish are those who see only the path of life and not the fact that it's going to end in death anyway. So it's kind of creative the way that he twists that, and I think there's something to this view of it, because later on we're going to get more into how he uses similar language to the strange woman from Proverbs. In verse 3, he says, "Sorrow is better than laughter, for by the sadness of the countenance the heart is made better." That word sorrow actually means something closer to irritation or anger. So irritation or anger is better than laughter. For by the sadness of countenance, that's an old King James style word. If you ever see that word countenance, it basically means your face or your appearance, how you look. So for by sadness of your countenance, your face, a sad face makes your heart better. I really like how the modern English version puts it, which I'm not gonna lie is actually rare for me. I'm not usually a big fan of the MEV, but in this case they nailed it pretty well. They said, "Grief is better than laughter, for with a downcast face the heart considers the good." I think this is a really important time that we remember chapter 3. If we go all the way back to chapter 3, we have those statements of there is a time to do this and a time to do that. And it's this beautiful picture of the balance in life, the ebb and flow, the rhythms of life, where sometimes there's a time to be sad, and sometimes there's a time to be joyful. Sometimes there's a time to go to war, sometimes there's a time for peace. And we talked about all that back in chapter 3. You can listen to our episode there for more on it. But I think it's important we remember that here, because this is not saying that it is always better to be sad than happy. Qoheleth is not saying you should walk around like Eeyore all the time with a rain cloud over your head. Last week we talked a lot about some deep topics, particularly of like depression and suicide, and how the average person doesn't necessarily go through life thinking about the darker side of life. It takes a certain type of personality that focuses on that, and sometimes more depressive personalities end up focusing on the negative of life, often even more times than they would care to. So Qoheleth here is not speaking to somebody like me, who often deals with depression. He's speaking to somebody more like the stereotypical, I think I used the example last week of Emmett from the Lego movie where everything is awesome. Just the happy go lucky, constantly cheery, type A, optimist, extrovert type of person. So, for that sort of person, it's good for them to realize that sometimes it's okay to be sad. And I think this is actually something that a lot of churches would do well to acknowledge because they tend to push this narrative that we have the joy of the Lord, we have to be happy all the time, and sometimes it's actually better to be sad, particularly if the occasion calls for it. Because it's only when we're sad that we often become more contemplative and consider the reality of life. I have never been to a party and then thought, oh, well, I should really text someone about how much I love them and appreciate them and we should get together for dinner sometime soon. But I have thought that after a funeral. So I think that's what he's trying to get at here is not to say we should constantly go around being miserable, but rather for the people who are maybe constantly going around blissfully ignorant of the misery of life, it would do you well to step back and consider the difficulty. There's a time for everything. So this is not a prescription for all of life, but rather it's a challenge not to avoid the sad times in pursuit of the glad times. A sad face can be the face of a person undergoing healing beneath the surface. And a happy face can be the face of a person who has chosen to ignore the reality of life. It kind of goes back to the Matrix example. Would you rather be a blue pill person, blissfully ignorant in the Matrix, or would you rather face the very real highs and lows of reality with the red pill? If I can spiritualize this into Bible interpretation for a minute, are you the type of person who is going to just accept at face value what people tell you about the Bible and go, yep, that's the nice, easy, clean answer, so that's what it is? Or are you the sort of person who's going to say, maybe there's some nuance and complexity to this, and maybe that's going to shatter my nice, neat little bubble of how I think the Bible should be interpreted? Now, if you're listening to this, I'm guessing you're more of a red pill person when it comes to the Bible, because otherwise you probably would have stopped listening a while ago. We are not here trying to tell you this is the one way and it's nice and simple and clean, and anyone who's ruining that for you just hates the Bible and God. No, we're telling you there is nuance, there is complexity, there is a lot of gray, and that sucks sometimes, especially when you think that there should only be one right way of interpreting the Bible. But reality is better than falsehood. It's better to live a difficult reality than an easy lie. In verse 5, Qoheleth says, it's better to hear the rebuke of the wise than for a man to hear the song of fools. This is actually less about praising correction, and it's more about connecting with the thought of the previous verse about the shortcomings of pursuing only happiness. So we all tend to think we're the wise person, right? We like to think, when I speak, I give out wisdom. But Qoheleth allows for no such self labeling. The wise person in his world is not the one who declares himself to be wise. The wise person is the one who lives in the tension of life and doesn't try to avoid the contradictions and the dissonance. The fool is the person who pretends that everything is okay in order to maintain his black and white existence. Shapiro notes, the instruction of the wise deepens your capacity for wisdom and compassion. This is how you know their words are wise. End quote. So don't just listen to somebody who says, here's something wise. Look at what they say and determine, does it deepen your capacity for both wisdom and compassion? That's when you can actually go, they're wise. And it's usually the people who don't tell you they're wise or don't market themselves as sages or gurus that are often the best people to listen to. Verse 6 continues the thought, for as the crackling of thorns under a pot, so is the laughter of the fool. This also is Hevel. Both brushwood and laughter are as fleeting, that Hevel word, as smoke or bubbles. They are Hevel, something that might be useful for a little time, but can't be held on to for extended periods. So again, realize that Qoheleth is not saying it's always foolish to laugh. He is qualifying the laughter by saying it is specifically foolish laughter if it's trying to distract you from reality by just making a joke of everything, by being blissfully ignorant. that isn't going to last. Laughter in any form isn't going to last. No matter how much you are uproariously laughing at something, you're going to be sad again, probably within the month. So it's not wrong to laugh. It's not wrong to be happy. It's not wrong to seek funny things or to have fun in life. But it's important that we realize that's not the end goal. And we can't hold on to those moments. We can only enjoy them while they're here. Verse 7 is interesting. He starts a new thought here, and he says, "Surely oppression makes a wise man mad, and a gift destroys the heart." Now, that word for oppression, it can mean that. It can also mean bribery. And the word that the Old King James has as mad here does not mean angry, but actually foolish. So madness in the sense of like crazy. And so I think if we take it that way, it makes more sense of what he's saying. Surely bribery makes a wise man insane, and a gift destroys the heart. In other words, corruption corrupts the person who accepts it. So this isn't saying you can't ever accept a gift for your birthday, but I think the gift has to be understood in terms of the bribe in the first half of the verse. He's saying that if you are taking a bribe, if you are playing favorites based on who can benefit you, you're actually killing yourself from the inside out. You're dying a slow death because you have already lost your morality. I think Brown explains it well. He says, Qoheleth concedes there are external conditions in which a wise person is forced to compromise his or her integrity. As Qoheleth has elsewhere remarked, there is more in common between the wise and foolish than meets the eye. Most notably, they share a common fate. That's back in chapter 2, verses 14 to 16. The ever-present possibility of moral compromise among the wise is also recognized by an otherwise unknown biblical sage named Agor, who prays to God that he be not poor, lest he, quote, steal and profane the name of my God. That's from Proverbs 39. The trauma of unmitigated oppression can knock a person morally senseless, forcing even the righteous into the mire of turpitude. However, relief from the toil of oppression, as in the form of sustenance and rest, is essential for the cultivation of wisdom and virtue. Wisdom is not the product of desperate measures. End quote. I want to pause and drill into this for a second. It reminds me of a quote. I know this came, at least when I first heard it, from a book by Sky Jethani. I don't know that was original with him, but he said that the line between good and evil does not run between me and you. It runs directly through me and directly through you. See, we like to think that there is a line between me on the good side, or us on the good side, our tribe, and them on the other side. They're the wicked ones, they're the bad ones, they're the bad guys. And we like to think that there's a nice clear-cut line between moral right and moral wrong. But the reality is the line between moral right and moral wrong actually goes straight through the middle of every single person. We have, each of us, the propensity both to do right and to do wrong. And it's not a simple, oh, they're a bad guy, thank God I am not like that person. No, it's the reality that even a wise person can make foolish choices that lead to a bad place. It reminds me very much of some really good shows and movies that play out this idea. A classic example is the Chris Nolan Dark Knight movie, where the Joker's whole premise is that all it takes is one too many bad days, one too many bad things to happen, and even a good person can become a villain. We all like to think, oh, the Joker's evil, he must have been that way his whole life. But the point is, no, actually, we all start off neutral, and we all have the propensity to go one way or the other. And we see both of those happen in the movie. Hopefully, I don't have to say spoiler alert here. I mean, the movie's like, what, 10 to 15 years old now? But you have this setup he has where he has a bomb that he has said is on these ferry boats. One has a bunch of prisoners, the other has a bunch of civilians. And if one is willing to blow up the other, their boat will remain safe. And so you have these prisoners, these criminals, and then you have these civilians, and they're not able to communicate with each other. And so there's this whole thing going on back and forth of, well, obviously the bad guys, the criminals, they're going to blow us up to save their lives, so we might as well do it first. I mean, they're already criminals. And again, spoilers, I guess, but neither one of the boats ends up blowing up the other. In fact, the criminal boat, the guy throws the detonator out the window so no one will do it. And so we have this stereotype where we look at people like that and we say, oh, they're other. They're on the other side of this. They've already made their choices. And they're just horrible people. And we like to look down from our ivory towers and say we're better. It was actually the criminals in that case that made the right choice before the normal civilians did. The civilians came closer than the criminals. And then on the flip side, Joker also takes Harvey Dent, who was called Gotham's White Knight, and actually turns him into the villain Two-Face there, to show that we are all just one bad day away from becoming the villain of somebody else's story. And I mean, this is in all kinds of other movies too. And I even think more recently there was a show that just came out on Netflix called Beef, where you have these two people who end up feuding with each other over a little bit of a road rage incident. It's a great show, so I will definitely try not to spoil anything. But you have someone at the start who seems to be the protagonist, and you're cheering for them at first, but the further on it goes and the more unhinged it gets, I mean, there's some unbelievable stuff that ends up happening throughout that show, and yet it's all just because of one choice after another that led to another and another and another, and people choosing not to be honest with each other, people choosing not to take the high road, people choosing to take revenge. And that really resonated with me as, we have these like comic book villains, and that's so impractical. The real villains in life are just normal people who have made a string of decisions or have often had circumstances kind of force them into that. I'm not saying that they didn't have agency. I still believe we're responsible for our own actions, but I think we also have to realize that sometimes circumstances push us one way or another, and it can become significantly harder to make the right decision. So I think this is really important for us to look at and say, who do we consider to be the villains in life? Maybe there's a neighbor or a boss or a coworker or, I don't know, somebody else in your community that you just think of as this absolutely horrible person. And you think they must have always been that way and I'm such a better person, right? Kind of sounds like the story of the Pharisee and the publican that Jesus told of the Pharisee going, oh, thank God I'm not like that person, right? We end up acting that way more often than we care to admit. And as we'll see in a little bit here in the chapter, Qoheleth is trying to remind us none of us are perfect. We all make mistakes. We all have bad days. And I'm not saying that every mistake, every sin, every crime is equal, but it's really easy to villainize somebody on the other side of something as other and saying, well, they made their choices, or if they hadn't done this, it would have not come out this way. But the reality is, sometimes circumstances push even the best of people to make really bad decisions. And we are all just one string of bad decisions away from ending up in the same place. So it's good for us to approach everybody that we meet with grace, patience, mercy, understanding, and realize that even if they're a little further down that line of the bad day than we are, maybe if we don't treat them in kind, we can start to bring them back a little bit closer to having a good day, to having a redemption arc. And maybe that also keeps us closer to having that redemption arc and further from going down that string of bad decisions ourselves. Verse 8, Qoheleth says, better is the end of a thing than the beginning thereof. Now, we've heard very similar in the first verse. That was talking about life. This is talking in general. And he goes on to say, the patient in spirit is better than the proud in spirit. Now, patient and proud aren't normally thought of as antonyms, right? We might think of patient versus impatient or proud versus humble. But here he puts patient and proud against each other. Now, patient in Hebrew is literally long-winged, and it's used to describe an eagle in Ezekiel. Now, this reminds me of another idiom in Hebrew to talk about being patient or long-suffering, if we want to use an old King James type word, and that's to say that somebody is long of nose. If you want to say that someone is really hot-tempered, quick to fly off the handle, you would say basically that they are short-nosed. And if they are really patient, you might say they have long nose. So even some passages that talk about God being long suffering, it's that he literally has a long nose. Now, that does not literally mean that God looks like Pinocchio, but we can think of it in terms of a fuse, having a short fuse versus, I mean, we don't really say long fuse in English. We say somebody has a short fuse, but, the opposite would be a long fuse. It takes longer for them to blow up, if we can put it that way. So it's kind of that same idea here. I think this is somewhat of a slow and steady wins the race kind of proverb. Cockiness or pride that assumes success before the end of a matter is inferior to the patient person who waits to celebrate. If I can spiritualize for a minute on this, it feels really applicable to a lot of Christians, especially having gone to Bible college. I was surrounded by people who engaged in this very cocky apologetics, eager to prove their own opinions and positions based solely on what people from their own circles had told them about their opponents. And I was one of those people. We didn't listen to the other side. We listened to what our side said the other side believed. And we hear what we want to hear, and we proudly declare the virtue of our position alone. That's how I treated belief for most of my life. But it's far wiser to listen to the whole matter from all sides and learn from others rather than rushing to prove your point. In verse 9, he says, "Be not hasty in your spirit to be angry, for anger rests in the bosom of fools." I like how Shapiro says, "Quick anger arises from fear." That's very interesting. Think about that for a second. Quick anger arises from fear. You hear something that threatens your ideas and ideals. Rather than cultivate the patience to see why you feel threatened, you lash out to protect your opinions. A nursed anger arises from jealousy. You imagine another has escaped Hevel and found permanence, and you resent that person for it. Rather than cultivate the patience to see that there is no escape from Hevel, you burn with envy and drive out all compassion for self and others. End quote. Now, I want to look at this from a therapy angle for a second, because I heard this sort of thing my whole life growing up. This was probably one of the more popular passages in Ecclesiastes, and it maps on to some others from other passages as well. But he'd say, don't be quick to anger. Well, that's fine to hear, but growing up, and especially as a teenager, I was still really quick to anger. It doesn't matter how many times you tell someone don't be angry, that doesn't really work, right? Anyone who's married can tell you, if your spouse is angry, it's not a great idea to say, hey, don't be so angry, right? So, how can we actually apply this? How can we actually learn not to be quick to anger? Because it's one thing to say it, it's another thing to actually learn how to apply it. And most people, at least that I've met in life, don't seem to have the mental health skills to work through their own emotions, and particularly anger. And this is something for everybody. I know we kind of have this stereotype of men are usually the ones who are quick to anger, but this is just people in general. We all experience anger, and that's okay. Anger is just an emotion. No emotion is wrong. You can't control your emotions. You can't control what you feel. You're going to feel them. As a human, we have emotions, and we can't help how they come up. If somebody tells you you can control your emotions, that's a lie. You can't. Now, you can control how you respond to them, you can control how you handle them, but you can't control what you feel. You are just going to feel it. And if you try to control it, that is a futile pursuit. Qoheleth would call that Hevel. So let's say that you get to a point where you feel angry. What do you do about it? Well, a lot of people end up just pushing it down. And they think, it's not appropriate to be angry right now. I learned at an early age, and they don't actually think this out, but this is the thought process that they're just skipping and not realizing. I learned at an early age it's not okay to be angry. This happens to so many of us where we're kids and we get angry, right? I mean, kids get angry just like anybody else, but they haven't learned yet what is acceptable in society. And I mean, nobody likes an angry kid, right? We don't even like angry adults, but kids lash out more with it. So parents often try to shut it down really quickly because, well, it's annoying to have a screaming kid. So we try to quiet them down really fast and say, no, 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 that's not okay. Don't do that. And I get why they do that, but that was a cheat. That was a shortcut. And what a lot of parents don't realize is they actually just taught us as kids that means it's not appropriate to express my anger. And so I have to bottle it down. I have to suppress it in order to appear acceptable in society. And that works for a time, but there's only so many times you can do that before it eventually comes out. Anger is a pressure cooker, and that's what Qoheleth is saying here when he says that anger rests in the bosom of fools. The bosom is like a way of saying the lap. Like if you're sitting down and say you have your kid sitting in your lap. That's the idea of this here. He's saying that anger sits in the lap of a fool. It is cradled there in safety in this person. It is fermenting, if you will, within their very being. Now, another option is that you can just immediately blow up when you're angry. You can just express it, try to get it out. And some people do that because they realize that once they do, they end up feeling better and they can apologize for it and just move on. But the reality is, either option ends up in blowing up. Even if you suppress your anger, you might think, hey, I'm better than that person who just blows up all the time because, man, I don't act like that. But in reality, your anger is actually probably worse when you do blow up because you have been holding on to it for so long. So, what should we actually do with it? Again, anger is not a bad thing. In fact, it's okay and sometimes even good to get angry about stuff. But there are healthy ways to express it. And I think it's important to realize that anger should rarely be taken out on another person. Now, it's okay to be angry about something happening. Like, oh, heck, about a month ago, I actually spilled a drink all over my computer. I fried it, and it was right before I was supposed to do an interview for the podcast, like literally minutes before. It was a mess. I was as angry as I have been in a very long time, and I'm sure the neighbors heard just how angry I was at that point. But my wife was in the apartment at the time, and it was not her fault. She wasn't, the one who knocked anything over, but it would have been very easy to take it out on her because that's another human being and it is an object for my anger. Yelling at my computer doesn't do anything to the computer. It's an inanimate object. It doesn't know I'm mad. We get some sort of a psychological satisfaction out of seeing the reaction from another person. And I had to be very careful to try to tell her right now, I am not mad at you. I just need a lot of time to myself right now, and all of the awful things you are about to hear for the next half hour have nothing to do with you. And it's okay to express that anger. And something that we don't always realize is that anger as an emotion actually is tied to the physical. And this is true of just about any emotion. We think that they're this ethereal thing, but they are connected to our physical bodies. And that's why sometimes, say you're scared, you physically start to shake. You're happy, you start to get a belly laugh, right? Where you convulse in your stomach as you're laughing. Our emotions affect our physical side as well. And so, in order to get that out of our system, sometimes we actually have to act physically. That can be, maybe you have a way of exercising. You have like a punching bag that you can take it out on. If you don't have that, you can punch a pillow, you can scream into a pillow. Heck, you can go for a run and just try to get that emotion out. I think it's healthy, though, to realize that it's better to put that out at something than someone. Now, sometimes we get angry at people, right? Sometimes somebody wrongs us, and it's okay to be angry with them, but it's usually better for us to step back and try to take that anger out physically through exercise or, I mean, heck, it can be aggressively dancing if you want to, putting on some nice heavy metal music and doing what you gotta do just to get that out of your system. That's okay. But by the time that we deal with other humans, we should try to get to a point where we have calmed down enough to where we can set aside that anger. And we might have to address it again afterward. I'm not saying bottle it down. I'm saying set it aside temporarily in order to come back to it and maybe even ponder it intellectually and say, why am I so angry? See, we get quick to anger when we don't have a good defense for something that we feel attacked on. Let me say that again. We get quick to anger when we feel like we don't have a good defense for something that we feel attacked on. Anger is basically like grief on steroids. is sadness with a vendetta. And particularly when it's something that somebody else has said to us or done to us and we weren't expecting it and we feel personally attacked, that's often when we get the quickest rise to anger because we feel taken aback by it. We weren't expecting it. And now all of the stuff that we maybe haven't even realized we've been suppressing for however long, basically since the last time you blew up, that all comes out now at this one particular instance. And because we don't actually have a good excuse for what happened or a good reason, then we start to take it out on the other person as the object of it. If you are someone who is quick to anger, you feel frustrated quickly and you start to blow up quickly, chances are you know that. Now, you might not admit that out loud, but you know it and you're frustrated by it. You don't like to see the way that it hurts other people around you. Now, this might be a little hard to hear, but if you are that sort of person who gets angry quickly over something, it's likely because there are things in your life from your past, that could be last week, that could be when you were a kid, that you have not actually gone back and fully addressed. This is why therapy is actually a really important thing. And I know there's the stereotype of, tell me about your mother, tell me about your childhood, tell me about your parents. Well, the reason that so many therapists go back to that time period in your life, even when it seems irrelevant, is because things happen when you're a kid. I mean, that's, 18-ish years of your life. Stuff happens in there that probably hurt you, and most of our parents didn't have the skills to teach us emotional well-being. They may have tried to teach us physical well-being, but the previous generations didn't focus on emotional intelligence, right? We have IQ, there's also EQ. You have, quote, emotional intelligence. And that's not a dig on previous generations. If anything, I mean, heck, they went through a lot of stuff that just didn't allow them the time to work on that. But now we have the time and the skills and the ability and the resources to work through that, to the point that there is no excuse for somebody to not start to work through this stuff. So that's why it's important now as an adult to be able to go back and say, can I heal what happened back then? When you get hurt, especially at an early age over something, your emotional growth kind of stops there. That's why sometimes you see people who can be 40 years old or 50 or 60 and they still act like an 8-year-old or a 13-year-old. Or somebody says, man, I'm just crying like a little girl, or I feel like a stupid kid, or whatever. That is them saying, I got hurt at that age and I'm still stuck there, but I don't realize it. So that's where therapy can come in and start to work through some of that stuff, so you can go back, basically heal that inner child that is still there inside of you that you don't realize, and bring yourself slowly into your present day to match your physical growth with your emotional growth. Now, that is a long process a lot of times, and it takes a lot of work, but it's worth it. You do not have to live as somebody who is constantly angry, either blowing up or pushing it down. Anger will happen, and that's okay, and you can learn to deal with that in a healthy way. You can learn coping techniques and little skills to be able to lessen the impact of that anger, not to push it away, but to deal with it in a healthy manner. But oftentimes, in order to heal that in the present, you actually have to go back and heal the past. Verse 10. This is a classic. Don't say, why were the former days better than these? You do not inquire wisely concerning this. Oh boy, this is the mindset of the good old days, right? We all know somebody who talks about how much better things used to be when they were a kid. And I think, in a sense, we all have this feeling of nostalgia at some point in our lives where we wish we could go back to the way things used to be. But there are some people who just constantly live in this idea that we need to go back to the past. Things were objectively better back then. We need to get back to the Leave It to Beaver sort of days where men were men, women were in the kitchen, and the world just looked more like me. At least as a white man, I can say that, right? Well, Qoheleth says, not so fast. Why are you inquiring of that? Why are you trying to say that the past was better than the present? Oh man, I know so many people growing up in a conservative religious circle. That is all I ever heard was about how much better the past was compared to the present, and how much we were just going to hell in a handbasket with the way things were today. I mean, heck, a lot of people I know won't even watch current TV shows or movies. They just literally only watch things that are in black and white, usually things that are pre 70s. And that's just insane to me. But that is, I'm trying not to get political here. I don't mean this as a diatribe against anyone of a conservative bent. I came from a conservative background. But just listen to the word conservative itself. You are conserving something. The whole idea of a conservative point of view is that we have to conserve the past, that the way things were is the way things should be. And that's great if you are a straight white male. That is not so great if you're pretty much any other gender, sex, or ethnicity. Now, again, we are not a political podcast, and I usually try not to make too many political points here, so I don't necessarily mean this in terms of politics like Republican versus Democrat as much as I do in the sense of ideology. I grew up only hearing that conservatives were the biblical stance. We have to try to get back to the way things used to be when the Bible and Christian values were the center of America, which honestly was itself just an ideal. America was never a Christian nation. I realize that's probably a controversial statement that might get me some flack, but America was founded on Christian values. It was founded by many who were Christians, but it was not a Christian nation. That is another issue for another day, but it's an important distinction that we have to make. But we would have this whole idea of conserving those values is the core, the most important thing for us as Christians. When in reality, I think the Bible is a very progressive book. Again, I'm not talking politics necessarily here. That is another conversation we could have another day. I just mean in the sense of ideology. Conservatives by nature just want to conserve the past. Progressives by nature think that we can progress into the future. So this is why there is so much difference between those two views. I know we're not talking politics, but you can easily see how this plays into politics. Somebody with a conservative bent is going to try to get things back to a quote unquote good old days of whatever they think that may have been. A person with a progressive bent is going to try to progress into the future. So this all boils down to the question, do you think our best days as humans are behind us, or do you think that they are ahead of us? That is the difference between a conservative and a progressive. Now, they might not realize that, they might not always say that, but that is the core difference. Do I think that we have to try to conserve old values, get back to the way things used to be, or do I think that we should try to progress into a better future? Now, there's a mix. There is value to both. I don't think that it's wise to be solely conservative, because then you are just living in the past and you miss out on both the present and the future. You sacrifice the next generation on your pipe dream of something that never actually even existed in the first place because it's an idealized nostalgia. You can look at any study on nostalgia and realize that things weren't actually as good back then as they are today. And that's not to say that today is perfect, but we have this idealized idea of the way things used to be. But it's also not wise to be solely progressive and totally ignore the past and tradition. Like, there is a reason tradition became tradition. It's because things worked that way. Now, does that mean we should keep things solely because they're tradition? No. But it also doesn't mean that we should solely throw out things because they are tradition. Now, if you've listened to this podcast for a while now, you probably realize that, at least philosophically speaking, I have a bit of a progressive bent that I come to with this. But I also have a conservative heritage, which is where I came from. So I try to acknowledge both of these and realize that depending on how you read the Bible, you could easily come across from both of them. But personally, I believe that the Bible does lean more into having this idea of we should be progressing forward. And this is, again, a whole nother conversation for another day. I think this particular verse is a great example of why conservatism on its own is not wise, because it is solely trying to relive the past. It is living in the past, and if you're living in the past, you can't live in the present. So Qoheleth says, it is foolish, you are not inquiring wisely if you're doing this. It is foolish to say, Man, why can't we just get back to the good old days? Why was it that yesterday was so much better than today? We only have the present. We no longer have the past, and we don't yet have the future. So that means that all that we have to work with is today. And only by focusing on today can we actually make tomorrow better. Now, I realize our ideas of what a better tomorrow might look like are probably going to be different for everyone, and that's okay. But if all you do is pine about the way things used to be, you're going to miss out on the way things are, and you're going to miss a chance to shape the way that things can be. See, absence makes the heart grow fonder. The longer we've been from the past, the better it looks. The past was not actually as pleasant as the stress of our present moment makes us believe. But the present is the only time we have in which to make a difference. So why pine over the past as if the present is a curse? The present is actually a gift from God in order to mold a better future. I find it quite interesting that Qoheleth placed this injunction right after his observation about the speed by which foolish people get angry. It's often those who are most fixated on the past who are the quickest to anger. Think about that uncle or grandfather that you have who is, maybe a little bit racist and a little stuck in his ways and is constantly talking about the way things used to be. I would venture a guess that he's also probably one of the quickest to anger people that you know. All he needs is one news headline or somebody to say the wrong thing, and he's going to fly off into some tirade about why things were better back then. This goes back to the idea that anger arises when we feel personally attacked. Even if it wasn't about us, we personally feel attacked, and we don't have a legitimate defense. The people who speak the loudest are often the people with the weakest answers. We add volume when we lack substance. Now, Pete Enns, who's over at the Bible for Normal People, did a blog post. I'll link to it in the show notes. But he had some really great thoughts on the fact that God isn't behind us, but actually ahead of us. I think it plays really well with this. He says the Bible itself bears witness to the process of moving forward rather than retreating to an idealized past. And so engaging the Bible seriously today means more than seeing it as a vault of unaltering static pieces of information. It means paying attention to this paradox of both old and new. It's never simply a choice between one or the other, but always both. It's never thinking that God is found only in one and not the other, but in both. It's never limiting God's activity to the past, but always asking where God might be out in front of us. Like Qoheleth, we live in a messy world made more and more complicated for generations now by explosions in technology and science. To think the Bible provides an escape from addressing constructively the challenges of our day is not only to miss the Bible's own witness, but will signal far and wide that the Christian faith is only prepared to wish for a past rather than create a future. Oh, dang, I'm not even finished with the quote, but we need to sit there for a second. If all you're doing is trying to conserve the way things used to be, you are signaling to everyone around you that your Christian faith is more concerned with the past than trying to create the future. Wow. He continues, engaging the Bible responsibly means today what it has always meant, embracing the expectation that God is doing a new thing among us. Our job is to discern what God is doing, not to isolate ourselves from that sacred responsibility by cloaking ourselves with proof texts. End of quote. Verse 11 is a little bit difficult to interpret, so let's take a look at this. Wisdom is good with an inheritance, and by it there is profit. And that's the word yitron that we've seen throughout the book, so it keeps showing up as an important word. It's the remainder, something at the end that is still there. Like if we think in terms of a math equation, the remainder. There is profit to them who see the sun. So wisdom is good with an inheritance, so another key word there. Heck, we actually have a lot of keywords in this, don't we? We have wisdom, hokmah. We have good, which is tov. We have yitron, remainder, the leftover, the profit, the benefit. And then we have a little bit of a play on a phrase we've had a lot, to them who see the sun. Now, we've had a lot of under the sun, but this is the first time we have for those who see the sun. And I think the idea with that seems to be those who are alive, the people who are still under the sun. They haven't gone into the afterlife yet. They haven't died. They're still around. So, what exactly does this mean, though? Is he saying, when he says wisdom is good with an inheritance, remember how we said that you can have the expression better than by saying good from in Hebrew? That's kind of this construction. So is he saying wisdom is better than an inheritance, so wealth, money, a lot of heritage? Or is he saying that wisdom is better if you have money to go with it? Wisdom is good with an inheritance? That is also a possible explanation. Is he saying wisdom is good to have when you have inherited money? So if you have an inheritance, it would be good to have a little bit of wisdom to know how to use it. So we kind of have like three different ways of looking at this. Is he saying wisdom is better than money? Wisdom is important when you have money? Or wisdom is better if you have money to go with it? And I'm not entirely sure. I would love to hear from you all. What do you think of that verse? How do you read it? Maybe he has multiple meanings here. Maybe he put some of that ambiguity in there on purpose, so we are forced to look at it from different angles. But if we continue the thought, he says, wisdom is a defense, and money is a defense. But the excellency of knowledge is that wisdom gives life to those who have it. So the idea throughout much of the Bible's wisdom literature, like Proverbs, is that wisdom is way better than wealth, right? To have wisdom is better than rubies. But Qoheleth takes a much more realistic stance, and he acknowledges that wisdom is actually only slightly more beneficial than money. In hearing the message of Ecclesiastes, Christopher Wright poignantly observes, wisdom is great, but money talks. I think he might be getting to the root of something here, where Qoheleth is saying money's good and wisdom is good. Wisdom is like a roof over your head. And in a way, so is money. Like, he's being practical. He's not just saying, oh, go out and be smart. He's saying, no, you kind of need money to live, too, right? That's when people say, oh, money isn't everything. It's like, yeah, it's not everything, but it is something. But wisdom does seem to have a slight advantage here in that it can increase life. Now, I don't necessarily mean make you live longer, but increase the value of life. When he says that wisdom gives life to those who have it, that can be saying wisdom keeps them alive, or it can be saying it brings them back to life. So, in other words, money can do a lot for you, but it does nothing for you once you're dead. But wisdom can reinvigorate you. And it kind of reminded me of somebody recently sent me something that said, money can't buy happiness, but it is more comfortable to cry in a Mercedes than on a bicycle. And I think Qoheleth would appreciate that, because sometimes people just they try to put money in realistic terms and be like, oh, money isn't all that. It's like, yeah, but it is something. But still, what's better is the wisdom to know what to do with what you have. And maybe with that wisdom, you can make a little bit more. Or even if you don't, you can just try to make the most of the life that you do have. Verse 13 says, consider the work of God. For who can make straight what he has made crooked? This is a really interesting question. I don't know too many Christians who would be comfortable with the thought that God can make anything crooked. This has been traditionally interpreted to mean that things that appear negative to us might actually be positive in the long run. There's something to that, but I think we can even expand the application here. A good example of what I think we could take from this is Peter's run-in with God in the book of Acts when he's on the rooftop and he has that vision where he's challenged not to call unclean what God has called clean. A lot of Christians have this black and white idea of what is straight and what is crooked, what is right and what is wrong. And they like to act as if God is clearly on their side. And that's how Peter was in that story in Acts. God says, here's a bunch of animals. Arise, Peter, kill and eat. And Peter's like, no, I'll pass on that. But thanks, God. They are all unclean animals. I'm not going to do that. And it sounds really great that Peter had his just say no button. But when God's the one who's telling you to say yes, maybe you should say yes, right? But this is just something where I think so many of us as Christians, we could literally have God come to us and say, this is okay to do. And we'd be like, nope, I'm good. I'm not going to do that. There are so many things that Christians get these idealized standards on of I am not going to cross this line because it must be sinful. And obviously there are some things that are wrong to do, but sometimes we draw the line way further back from the cliff's edge than God has. I think I've used this illustration before in the podcast, but my family likes to camp at a place down in Maryland. There's this lighthouse you can hike to, and it's literally on a cliff's edge over the Delaware Bay area. So relatively recently, the last like 5 to 10 years, the I guess the National Park Service or whatever there put up a little fence. And when I say a little fence, I mean like one of those plastic things that you can get from Lowe's or Home Depot. It's doing nothing. But the idea is don't go past this. And honestly, I don't even think that thing was a foot from the ledge. Like, it's not going to do a lot. But the people there decided this is a good place to say, don't go past this or you are in danger. And you might look at that and say, well, actually, I'm going to stand 10 feet back from the ledge so that I never fall over. And that's okay if that's your personal standard, but just realize you are missing out on 10 feet of the cliff that the authorities said it's okay for you to walk around. Now, again, it's totally fine if you choose not to walk those 10 feet, but it's a problem when you move the fence back to where you drew the line and tell everyone else this is where the authorities say to draw the line. This is what so many Christians do. They have their own personal standard, and that's okay, but then they start to make it about what pleases God, of this is what God wants, so this is where I drew the line. And if you don't draw the line exactly where I do, well, then you're not disagreeing with me, you're disagreeing with God. They could literally have Jesus himself come to them and walk in those 10 feet between the two fences, and they'd be like, nope, you are way off there, Jesus. You need to get back here with me where we can please God. Like, if God says something's okay, it's okay. I just can't help but think, looking at this, we have here in the Bible, who can make straight what God has made crooked? Something can appear to us as crooked that is actually straight. And that says less about God's morality than it does our warped view of reality. There might be people, practices, or beliefs that you see as crooked, but that are just how they're supposed to be in God's sight. So if you see something where another Christian is saying, this is straight, and you say, that's crooked, maybe God has actually given them the peace to realize that it's straight, it's okay, it's right. And just because it looks crooked to you doesn't mean it actually is in God's eyes. Verse 14 is a really interesting verse. It reads, in the day of prosperity, be joyful. Now remember, that's that word tov. So it's literally, in the day of prosperity, be good. But in the day of adversity, consider. God has also set one over against the other, to the end, or for the reason, that humans should find nothing after him. Now, that is not exactly an easy verse to read in English. There's definitely some wordplay happening here in Hebrew. If you were to read it in Hebrew, you would hear the similarity in some of these words. It reads, Beyom teva, chaya betov ra'a riyah. So you have similarity in sounds with Bayom Tov Heye Betov U Beyom Ra Rie. So you have a lot of similarity of words there, and he's definitely engaging in some wordplay. I like how the New Interpreter's Bible commentary said, if a day is good, be good with it. Now, I like that, but in reality, I think this is one of those verses where Qoheleth kind of leans into a bit of determinism, where he seems to have this idea that God gives both the good days and the bad days. And there is value in that view. We've talked about this in the last few chapters, where if you have the idea that good comes from the hand of God, you can't just stop there. If you're going to be consistent and say that God controls all the good things in life, you also have to be honest enough to say that God controls all the bad things in life, at least if you believe that he is sovereign or all-powerful. Someone coming from like an open and relational theology sort of thing like Tom Ward would say that God is responsible for the good stuff because he actually isn't all-powerful. Now, if that scares you, go back and listen to our episode with Tom Ord from the start of this year, where he goes into some of that in more detail. It's actually not as weird and heretical as it sounds, but that's not our focus for today. If you have this idea that God is omnipotent, all powerful, all controlling, sovereign, kind of the typical Calvinistic view of God, that leads you down this path. If I can do what Qoheleth does, if I can take your belief system and pull it further than you want it to go, we have to get to the conclusion that God is responsible for both the good and the bad. And we find this here. We also find it in Job. And it's a very uncomfortable position to say that God is responsible for both the good and bad things that happen to me in life. And that sounds okay when you say, I praise God that I got a raise at my job, and, well, God allowed me to get a flat tire so I could learn patience, or whatever. Maybe there was an accident further up the road, and maybe I would have ended up in that accident if I didn't get the flat tire. That's okay. I can live with that until we draw this again to its natural end. We drag it kicking and screaming a little further than it wants to go. And we say, what happens when it gets a little more serious? When it's no longer about a flat tire and now it's about rape or sexual abuse of some sort, or death of a family member, maybe death of a child, right? Once we start making this the more, I don't even want to say extreme cases, because honestly stuff like that happens every day, then it becomes really uncomfortable to put that in God's hands and say, oh, he did that because that's what you needed in your life right now. It's one thing to say, man, I guess I didn't want a flat tire today, but I guess I needed it because that's just what God gave me. It's another thing to say, I didn't want to be sexually abused, but I guess that's what I needed because God gave that to me. That's not something I'm very comfortable with. And I'm just going to be honest and say I'm not sure I agree with Qoheleth here to say that God provides both the day of prosperity and the day of adversity. That's just not a portrait of God I like. It is possible. I mean, a lot of Christians hold to that view. I don't want to say it's completely impossible, but it just makes me really uncomfortable. I'm going to be honest with y'all. This is hopefully some of that epistemic humility we talked about at the start of the episode. I'm going to be honest enough to say I don't like where this view goes. This is the danger of belief in a fully sovereign God. He then becomes responsible for not only the good things that happen to me, but also the bad things. And do I really want to trust that God? And I know some people will say, oh, but he's got it all in control. He's got this big plan, and at the end, even the bad stuff's going to make sense. Okay, that wouldn't work for literally anybody else. If I was really nice to my wife some days and really abusive other days and said, you know what, the abuse seems bad to you, but actually I just did it to drive you to become a better person. I wanted to push you to the extreme so that we could refine your character. I mean, any one of you listening would say, you're a horrible husband, and honestly, your wife should probably leave you. And you know what? You would be right. So why is it wrong for me, but right for God? We go, well, God's ways are higher than our ways. Okay, that's not what that passage means. I got to do a short about that someday soon, because that keeps coming up in Ecclesiastes. So just trust me for right now. That is not what that passage actually means. We'll do a short soon so that I can finally say, go check out that short instead of just, that's another thing for another day. But something doesn't become right just because God does it. Now, a lot of Christians seem to think that. They think whatever God does, it must be right. So if he does something bad, or seemingly bad, it must actually be good, and it's my fault that seems bad. See, I'd like to turn that on its head and say, God only does what's right. Therefore, if something he does seems to me to be bad, I must have misunderstood what actually happened, or I must have attributed to God what he didn't actually do, because God can only do what is right. See, there's a huge difference between those two views, and it may sound like semantics, but the application is hugely different. Do I think that whatever God does, whether it be good or bad, must be good because God does it? Or do I think that God only does good, therefore, if it appears like something bad happened because of God, I either misunderstood it or I misapplied it to God when it was really the result of something else? I think that is a much healthier way to view the text. So I'm actually going to differ with Qoheleth here, but I want to leave room open for debate and for some conversation. So I'd love to hear what you all think about this. Does Qoheleth's view of a sovereign God who provides both good and bad sit okay with you? Does it make you uncomfortable? Do you have a different suggestion for how we can look at this sort of thing? Love to hear from you. Remember, you can write in on our website. You can comment on our socials. You can email cconn at thebibleuncut.com. Reach out to us and keep the conversation going. Oh, before we go any further, I do have to mention the end of the verse, too, because that can be a little hard to understand. He says, to the end that no one should find anything after him. That can mean one of two things. It can either be saying that, like, once God has established this, that's the final say. There is nothing more that you can add to this. Or some people actually translate it differently as to the end that no one should complain afterward. And either one is grammatically possible. It just kind of depends on how you translate a couple words. But I think the end result is kind of the same, whether it's saying you can't question God or you can't complain about what God says. This is a good point for us to remember that there are multiple passages throughout the Bible where people do actually question God, and it's okay. We have basically the entire book of Job about this. And yes, God does get a little feisty in that at times with Job, but he never says that Job was a horrible person for questioning what happened. He just says that Job wasn't able to understand why it happened. Those are two different things. And we have tons of Psalms where the psalmists are questioning why God did what he did. Heck, that's half of the prophets too, right? So we have so many different passages where people do respectfully disagree with what God has allowed to happen and they question it. And that is okay. So I think it's worth saying that this is Qoheleth's view, and he had somewhat of a deterministic view of God. And we've talked about this in other passages where we don't always have to take it to be basically Calvinism, but he does kind of lean that way, and it's worth acknowledging, right? There are multiple voices in Scripture. There is multivocality in Scripture, and sometimes we get people who emphasize the sovereignty of God. Other times we get people who emphasize the free will of humanity. And here, I don't think Qoheleth is trying to push Calvinism. I think he's trying to say that we think we rule our lives, and in reality, there is a force greater than us. And whether you call that God, the universe, just life itself, fate, luck, whatever it may be, we can't fully game the system. You can stack the odds in your favor, but things are still going to work according to the way that the house has laid it out. So I think this had a little bit more of an oomph a couple thousand years ago when he first said it. And I think we have to realize that we have a couple thousand years now of using this to silence questions against God, and I don't think that's what Qoheleth meant at all. I think that he was just trying to say, stop trying to control your life and realize that there are some things that are going to happen no matter what you do. Moving into verse 15, he says, everything I have seen in the days of my vanity. This is the first time he takes on Hevel. He says, my life has been Hevel. There is a just person who perishes in his righteousness, and there is a wicked person who prolongs his life in wickedness. So be not over righteous much, neither make yourself overly wise. Why should you destroy yourself? Don't be overly wicked, and don't be foolish. Why should you die before your time? It's good that you should take hold of this. Indeed, take from this and withdraw not your hand, because whoever fears God will come forth of them all. Wisdom strengthens the wise more than 10 mighty who are in the city. And we'll stop there. I love this passage because it baffles so many people. Qoheleth literally says, don't be too righteous and don't be too wise. Why should you destroy yourself? And he prefaces this all by saying that you can't game the system. There are righteous people who die young, and there are wicked people who live to a ripe old age. And we've all seen this happen, right? It's not always true that going the straight and narrow is going to pay off in the end. Sometimes that life gets cut off short, and sometimes the people who cheat make it to the end first. So his response to this is, don't be too righteous. And in verse 17 he says, don't be too wicked. We expect from the Bible, don't be wicked. We don't expect to hear "don't be too wicked," as if there's a spectrum here of wickedness, that just don't go too far down the line. And we definitely don't expect "don't be too righteous." We would think, well, there's no limit to how good a person I can be, right? I should just try to be as good as possible. And this is kind of like the slippery slope idea that a lot of people have, where if you go too far, and it's usually in the left direction, they'll say, you're just going down this slippery slope and you're not going to realize what's happening. But what those people don't realize is that no mountain has one slope. Every mountain has more than one slope, and there is a slippery slope on either side of the mountain. So you can go too far to the right, you can go too far to the left. It's not as if the only way to go too far in something is in one direction. You can go too far even doing a good thing, right? What's the saying? Too much of a good thing is still too much. And I think it's fascinating that Qoheleth presents fearing God as the alternative between being too righteous and too wicked. So what that tells me is that you can be too righteous and yet still not fearing God. And if I can be honest, I think that summarizes a lot of people I knew growing up. They are the sort of people that the old saying is they are too heavenly minded to be of any earthly good. The sort of person who's a goody two shoes that thinks that by their ultra Christian standards, they are better than everyone else. You might have a church where the average person in it maybe isn't drinking, maybe they're not doing drugs or having sex before marriage or even watching an R-rated movie. But then you get the person who says, well, I won't even touch a bottle of alcohol, or I won't even go to a restaurant where they sell alcohol. I actually knew people like that. They say, yeah, you're not taking illegal drugs. Well, I won't even take some CBD for a headache. Heck, I won't even take Tylenol for a headache. Again, I knew Christians like that. Oh, you're not having sex before marriage. Don't even hold hands. Don't even kiss. Just court, have an I kiss dating goodbye sort of thing. Oh, you won't watch R-rated movies. I won't watch movies with any cursing in it whatsoever. And going back to the whole cliff thing, right? If that's your personal standard, that's your personal standard. I'll respect that. But don't act as if that makes you more righteous in God's sight. There is such a thing as being so heavenly minded that you are no earthly good. You're just so focused on trying to live this ascetic life where you don't enjoy any of the pleasures of the world around you, that you actually miss out on the fact that God created the world around you and He wants you to enjoy this life. That doesn't mean be licentious, live it up, and have no rules, no morals, no boundaries. No, absolutely not. But there is a lot of room in between no morals and not living at all. There's a lot of gray in between those two extremes. And when you act as if it's one or the other, well, that is pleasing God no more than the person who is way too wicked. To destroy yourself, that word literally means to make uninhabited or to cause to tremble. So if you think of like an ancient army attacking a city, they might cause the inhabitants of it to tremble, or maybe even make the walls tremble and fall down, if you think of like Jericho, and then they will make the city uninhabitable. Well, if I can spiritualize for a second, there is something called scrupulosity. I realize that's not a super common word, but it's actually a super common thing, especially in relatively conservative evangelical circles. Scrupulosity is a form of OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder. Now, a lot of people, when they hear OCD, they think it means that you have to have all the pens on your desk perfectly parallel and in a line. It can look like that, but not usually. Obsessive compulsive disorder is suggesting that you have an obsession that you then must meet through a compulsion. So it might look like you have this obsessive fear over not being safe in your own house. So you are then compelled to constantly check the front door, even though you've already made sure it's been locked 5 times. Or maybe you have this obsession over not getting sick, so you then feel compelled to wash your hands even though you just washed them 30 seconds ago. That is more so what OCD is. Well, scrupulosity is the religious side of that. Scrupulosity is when you have a moral or religious obsession over something, usually something that you deem to be sinful, and so you then feel compelled to do something in order to avoid that. This can look like having constant thoughts or worries about being too sinful, or having crossed a line that God can't forgive, or wondering about, oh, am I actually saved? Did I actually mean when I asked Jesus into my heart? So it might be the person who constantly prays a sinner's prayer because they're afraid of being left behind in a rapture or something like that. Or it might be someone who just constantly feels guilty over the slightest little thing, like they worry about, oh, I went 55 miles per hour in a 45 zone, and did I sin? Do I actually have to go tell the police that I did this? Now, I realize some people listening to this might think that's extreme and stupid and silly, but in actuality there are a lot of Christians who think that way. People who worry over, did I commit the blasphemy against the Holy Spirit? Did I commit an unforgivable, unpardonable sin? Did I actually mean it when I prayed for salvation? Am I really going to hell? Am I going to be left behind? They walk the corner and their family member isn't there when they thought they would be, and so they suddenly worry about the rapture and they pray a quick prayer like that. That is a very, very real thing, and it's way more common than you might think. That is a perfect example of being too righteous. It comes from a good place. That comes from somebody who just wants to please God. But because of the way they have been trained and taught by pastors and preachers who don't think about the person like that, they just think, oh, I'm saying this and everybody understands the way I'm presenting it. They don't realize that some of us have overactive consciences, and we are going to take it to the extreme and worry and stress over every little thing that never even crossed their minds. That is a very real thing, and that is an example of being overly righteous. If you are that sort of person who has extreme religious anxiety, maybe you get panic attacks in church, or you can't enjoy time with family because you're afraid that they're going to hell and you need to witness to them or something like that, that is a perfect example of what Qoheleth means of don't be overly righteous. That is taking a good thing too far. And it comes from a great place. It comes from a place of caring and wanting to please God and wanting to see others safe and healthy and in eternity with you, and all of that great stuff. And that is a whole other conversation for another day. But I just want to tell you, if you feel that way or you know someone who does, you're not alone. There are a lot of us out there. This is the side of fundamental Christianity that they don't want you to hear about. And when I say fundamentalism, I also mean evangelicalism. This doesn't just have to be the extreme King James only type of church. It's easy to think, oh, we're not that bad. We're better than that. We're more mainstream. We're more midline. We're more middle of the road than that. Well, it is still very easy to fall into this sort of thing. And there are resources out there that you can search for scrupulosity. You would be amazed the things that come up, and you might even be amazed some of the boxes that you yourself check on that. And again, that is not everybody, but I have known a lot of Christians who fall into that without even realizing it, and they think that they're pleasing God, but they don't realize that there is a slippery slope on both ends of the mountain, and it's possible to go too far in the right direction. So, going back to the meaning of that word destroy, if I can spiritualize for a minute and we look at the meaning being to make uninhabitable or to cause to tremble, scrupulosity makes a person uninhabitable to their friends. Nobody wants to be around that sort of person. If you're the sort of person who says, oh, I won't watch any movie with any cursing, or I won't listen to any secular music, or I won't even go to Olive Garden because they serve wine, nobody wants to be around that person. And again, I'm not trying to shame you if that is your personal belief. I get that we all have different standards, but have a little grace for the Holy Spirit to work in different ways in different people's lives. And don't be the weaker brother that Paul talks about and shame everybody else for following God in a little bit of a different way than you. Furthermore, scrupulosity can literally make a person's own body tremble with anxiety. And I mentioned panic attacks a little bit ago. Man, I would love to see this study done, but I honestly think that there is probably more anxiety and panic attacks that happen in evangelical and fundamentalist churches than in any other group by comparison. because they are constantly hearing about how they are not good enough, how they are horrible, rotten sinners on their way to hell. Everybody they know is on their way to hell. And when you hear that every week, and I've used this illustration before on the podcast, and when we were in college, there was literally a preacher who came in and said, "You are all cockroaches in God's sight. Like, that is how horrible you are." I'm sorry, but apparently you've never read John 3:16. Now, I realize there are passages in the Bible that talk about sin. I am not talking about a lovey-dovey gospel that doesn't ever talk about the negative things. But I'm talking about a gospel that is not a gospel. All it ever talks about are the negative things. That's all we ever heard growing up, was this railing on people who only preach love and don't preach justice and sin. Well, our circles took it too far growing up, because all they preached was sin and never love. They might say love, but they still filtered it through this lens of sin that they love to harp on. That is going too far on the other end. And it's amazing the number of people I know who get anxious just sitting in a church service. They feel like something's wrong with them. I shouldn't be feeling this way in church. This is supposed to be a haven. This is supposed to be a healing place. Why do I feel so panicked? Well, dear friend, if you happen to be one listening to this, I can tell you the problem is not with you. The problem is with what you are hearing every week. Any other situation where you got such a negative message constantly, people would tell you to leave. If you had a friend that you hung out with 3 times a week, and every time you saw them, they told you what a horrible, rotten person you were, you would naturally hate being around them. You would naturally start to develop anxiety every time you went to see them. You would naturally want to be literally anywhere else, and you would start to not feel safe around them. That is natural. So why do we think it's okay in church if it's not okay with another person? Again, it's okay to preach on sin. It is okay to preach against injustice and wrong and all of that. But balance, people. Please. I don't know that we have pastors or preachers listening to this, but if you are, please stop being so negative in all your sermons and start preaching balance. Preach what the Bible calls the whole counsel of God. And you know what? A good bit of the Bible is positive and hope-filled. Not every single page, but also not every single page is Debbie Downer and how horrible people are. Stop projecting your own insecurities and inadequacies on your congregation and taking it out on them and calling it good preaching, and start giving them love and hope. Whew. All right, apparently I just started preaching. That hit a nerve for me. But all of that to say, you can go too far in even a right direction. Interestingly enough, this whole idea of being overly righteous can also mean to present yourself better than you are. Isn't that interesting? It fits so well into this idea of scrupulosity. It's well-meaning, but we like to present ourselves as holier than thou. We like to think we're actually better than we are. We look down on someone else when they get caught in some sin or when they have some habit that they can't break. And secretly, we're cradling our own stuff, but we just haven't gotten caught yet. So we think that we can get away with looking down on other people. Well, Qoheleth says there is no benefit to pretending that you're better than you are. Because, like he said in verse 15, sometimes the righteous don't actually get rewarded. Now, interestingly enough, destroy can also mean to confound or to confuse. So from this point of view, Qoheleth is advising you not to present yourself as better than you are, lest you become appalled by the lack of treatment that you think you deserve. Someone who presents themselves as better than everyone else thinks they deserve better treatment because they are better than everyone else. But you're not going to get better treatment because you're not actually better than everyone else. So Qoheleth says, don't even pretend, because other people are going to see through it and know that you're just as messed up as them. So you're going to get an equal treatment, which is less than you think you deserve. So don't be surprised when it happens. Shapiro in Ecclesiastes Annotated and Explained puts it well. He says, don't obsess over evil or foolishness. This only courts an easy death. So many Christians I knew growing up would preach against being obsessed with foolishness as if that was, somebody who just lives this raucous lifestyle. And they never realized that they themselves were actually obsessed with sin. It just so happened to be preaching against it. This was a huge thing with purity culture. I guess I'm not done my rant yet here. That this was huge about purity culture, right? It got presented as this thing about avoiding sex before marriage and avoiding all of the pitfalls and problems of having multiple partners and all of that. And it became about this whole thing of how culture was obsessed with sex. And so we just avoid all that in the church. Well, the more you preach that, the more you are obsessing over sex. Few people are as obsessed with sex as fundamentalist Christian preachers because they constantly talk about it. And they think that they're not obsessed with it because they're preaching against it, but you're still obsessed with it. Let's say there's a restaurant you absolutely love going to and you obsess over telling everyone about it. But I hate that restaurant. So I start telling everybody how awful it is. You might think, oh, he's not as obsessed with that restaurant as I am. Actually, I'm just as obsessed with the restaurant as you are, just from the opposite end. And so that's what it became about, is these preachers would preach against, honestly, a straw man, a sort of person who is obsessed with sinning, and they don't realize that they themselves are actually obsessed with sinning, just from the opposite end. And when you focus on the negative constantly, we shouldn't be surprised when you yourself end up being a negative person or end up doing the very thing that you have preached against. Remember how I said earlier that the people who speak the loudest are usually the ones who are most insecure about that very area themselves? That's why you have preachers who constantly preach against sex and end up having an affair, or who constantly preach against homosexuality and then you find out that they had an affair with somebody of the same sex, or they're constantly preaching against anger and they blow up at home with their own family. The louder you speak against something, the more it's probably an indication that you yourself feel weak in that area. So sure, it's not a great idea to go out and constantly live this horrible sinful life, but it's also not a great idea to make your whole life about preaching against that. Sometimes it's better to focus on the positive and talk about what we should be doing instead of just focusing on all the time what we shouldn't be doing. Okay, I think my rant is over for now. There's an ancient idea purported by Aristotle in Nicomachean Ethics that suggests that you have a middle way in between two different extremes in life. And the most virtuous way is the middle. And you have what is sometimes called temperance, and the other side being licentiousness. In other words, you can have, as the Word Biblical Commentary puts it, an excess of pleasure or an insensitivity, which is a deficiency of pleasure. And neither one is the right way. Virtue is in the middle of those two extremes. Now, granted, Murphy in that Word Biblical Commentary goes on to claim that Aristotle's views have no bearing on what Qoheleth is talking about here, but I actually disagree with him, and I think it fits pretty well. This is a classic example of the contrasting wisdom of the Bible, of the multivocality of Scripture. A lot of Christians look at the Bible as if it is just this one-voiced thing that wherever I open it up, there is only one opinion from Genesis through Revelation, and it's the same consistent voice throughout. But in reality, there are all different views throughout Scripture. I mean, it was written by dozens of people across 1,000 years in different parts of the Middle East, and in different cultures, and even in different languages. So you will get contrasting wisdom. And this is a perfect illustration of it, of how you should neither be too righteous nor too wicked. See, if you are too much of a literalist or a fundamentalist, you're going to get tripped up over this sort of thing, because he is giving two opposing statements side by side. There's a similar situation in Proverbs that says, "Answer not a fool according to his folly, lest you be like him. Answer a fool according to his folly, lest he be wise in his own conceit." Or deceit. I think it's conceit, in his own pride. That sounds right. So, you have this side by side, literally one verse right after another, saying the exact opposite thing. And sometimes that freaks people out. And I'm like, no, that's actually beautiful, because it all depends on your situation. Going back to the start of the episode, which is true? Opposites attract, or birds of a feather flock together? Well, what's the circumstance? Sometimes it's better to have similar things together, sometimes it's better to get a second opinion from a different angle. This is classic biblical wisdom literature. It presents multiple sides, multiple angles, because the authors knew that not everything can be one size fits all. In fact, most things can't be one size fits all. There is no one answer to everything in life. Different circumstances require different courses of action. Interestingly enough, this passage here in Ecclesiastes is reminiscent of the Aramaic proverbs of Ahikar. I'm guessing none of you have ever heard of that before, because I hadn't either until I was studying this. But much like in other series, like in Genesis, we've seen how the Bible draws on the culture of its day. And the Proverbs of Ahikar are an ancient text, likely predating Ecclesiastes, where this person named Ahikar was like an official in the court of the Assyrian kings Sennacherib and Esarhaddon. He adopted his nephew, but his nephew then betrayed him and tried to tell Esarhaddon that Ahikar was a traitor. Esarhaddon tried to have Ahikar killed. Ahikar, through his wisdom, actually escaped Esarhaddon, and you kind of learn some of his wisdom through that work. Well, one of the proverbs in that work says, "Do not be too sweet, lest you be swallowed. Do not be too bitter, lest you be spat out." And so you can see kind of some similarity to what Qoheleth is saying there. It's neat to see the way that similar wisdom has developed across multiple traditions. Verse 18, he says, "It's good that you should take hold of this, and don't withdraw your hand, because the one who fears God will come forth of them all." Literally, this verse reads, "It is good that you grasp this, and also don't rest your hand from it, because the one who fears God goes out to them all." Now, we have no clue what it means, the one who fears God goes out to them all. That is not easy to interpret. But some translators and commentators have suggested that "all" at the end of the verse actually means both ways laid out in the previous two verses. So the person who goes too far into their own righteousness, the person who goes too far into their own wickedness, the person who fears God is going to prevail over both of them. So if those are the only other two options, well, that's everybody, so that's all. So that's where you get that. The idea seems to be that you shouldn't try to get ahead in life either by being better than everyone else or by being badder than everyone else. Rather, if you are going to hold on to anything as a way to have the best life possible, just try to fear God. Now, that leads us into this phrase, fear God, and it's something that is frequently used in the Bible's wisdom sections to communicate the need for a reverence before a being who is several leagues above your own. And it's often used as a way to shut down complaints about your life because, well, God is in control, you're not him, and you obviously don't know his plans. And you'll get some people who will try to soften it and say, well, it's not actually fear, it's just reverence or honor. And it definitely has the ideas of reverence or honor, but it also can have the idea of fear. And so the way you interpret this is kind of going to depend on your idea of God and what you think he wants from you. It is possible to read this as actually fearing God, and I think that fits, especially in an ancient mindset where, well, you have this deity that you attribute stuff to that you can't control, so he's obviously way more powerful than you. I mean, if he can literally speak things into existence in Genesis 1, right? I mean, what can he do to you? Can he speak you out of existence? Like, you should be afraid of that being. But I can also understand why some people would not be comfortable with that. I mean, this isn't the Michael Scott.
Would I rather be feared or loved? Easy, both. I want people to be afraid of how much they love me.
That doesn't work. If I told Jana, my wife, oh, I want you to fear me so that you actually love me, well, we're back to all of you going, you're a horrible husband, and she should probably leave you. And you would be right. That's not healthy. In fact, doesn't the Bible itself even say perfect love casts out fear? So I don't like this idea of fear of God actually being fear. And I don't even think it's fully honest with the text to just retranslate it as, well, honor God or respect God. I think these people actually truly did believe that you should be afraid of this being. And I think that as time went on, and we get hopefully a better understanding of God's nature and character and person, and once we meet Jesus, we go, that's not something or someone we should be afraid of. That's someone that, yes, we can respect and honor them, but love comes before fear, and love has no place for fear. So I would think that Qoheleth here actually got it wrong. I don't think that we should fear God in the sense of being afraid of him. If you want to say we should respect God, that's fine. But I think we need to be honest and say that he probably actually thought fear. And I don't think that's actually what God wants, because no truly loving relationship wants you to be afraid of that person. Honestly, I think if we can just boil it down to the idea, in a practical sense, there is value in just accepting that life does not follow our rules or bow to our whims. And I think when Qoheleth first uttered these words, they packed more of that punch of an idea than what we get out of it today. Again, after 2,000 years of people talking about his words and similar sayings, we've gotten this idea that fear God means we can't ever question the way of the world or why bad things happen. And it's turned into preachers who say, sit down, shut up, and stay in your lane. And that's just not healthy. And if I'm being honest, I even kind of wonder if these are actually the words of Qoheleth. In the first couple episodes for Ecclesiastes, we talked about how there are two main voices in the book of Ecclesiastes. We have Qoheleth, but we also have the frame narrator who steps in at the beginning and the end to introduce and conclude what Qoheleth is saying. I kind of wonder if the frame narrator stepped in here, because the frame narrator seems to be much more traditional, much more conservative than Qoheleth. Qoheleth is a bit of an extremist. He's a little bit on the fringe. The frame narrator steps in and tries to reel him back. We'll get to that when we get to the last chapter. But I kind of wonder if this is the frame narrator stepping back in here, because this just feels a little too traditional for the rest of what Qoheleth has said so far. Nowhere else does he say, just fear God and act like everything's going to be okay. So I kind of wonder if this is actually the frame narrator stepping in and interjecting. That being said, Qoheleth is thinking out loud through this whole thing and just inviting us to listen in to his ramblings. So it could also just be, like we mentioned at the start of the episode, maybe he's just trying to piece together a coherent worldview after all of these disparate experiences he's had. Somehow, fearing God ends up in the middle ground between being overly righteous and overly wicked. So I think the key takeaway for us is realizing that you can't make your life work out by checking all the boxes, being overly righteous, or by cutting all the corners, being overly wicked. Both will just exhaust you and lead to ruin. So instead, realize that life is out of your hands and do the best you can where you are. Free yourself from the pressure of having to be good enough for God or other people. Verse 19 is a bit of an oddball here. It says, wisdom strengthens the wise more than 10 mighty who are in the city. This verse doesn't really fit comfortably with the verses before or after it. Right? We've been talking about being overly righteous or overly wicked. And here he says, wisdom strengthens the wise more than 10 in the city. Well, that doesn't really fit. And then when we get into the next several verses, he talks about how no one is actually as good as they think they are, and we should be more patient with other people. We'll get to that in a second. So, some commentators actually have suggested that this verse got misplaced, and that it should have been placed after verse 12. Verse 12 is where he said, for wisdom is a defense, and money is a defense, but the excellency of knowledge is that wisdom gives life to them who have it. This fits that better than it fits here. So let me just read verses 12 and then verse 19, and then I'm going to read verse 18 and verse 20. And I think you can see the way that these ideas flow better in that order. So first verse 12, then I'm going to jump this verse 19 right after it. Then we'll come back to 18, skip 19, and put 20 as if it was just right after 18. Here goes. For wisdom is a defense, and money is a defense, but the excellency of knowledge is that wisdom gives life to those who have it. Wisdom strengthens the wise more than 10 mighty who are in a city. It is good that you should take hold of this. Yea, also from this withdraw not your hand, for whoever fears God will come forth of all of them. Because there is no one just on the earth who does good and doesn't sin. Also take heed to these words that are spoken, lest you hear your servant curse you. And we'll get to that again in a second here. And maybe this is something that would make more sense if you could read it. I don't know how well that transferred over audio, so if you get a second, obviously if you're driving, don't do this right now, but when you get a second, pull up Ecclesiastes 7 and read verse 19 after verse 12, and then read straight through 18, skip 19, and just keep reading. Personally, I think it flows better and it makes more sense in those contexts. So just looking at this verse, no one is quite certain why he mentions 10 rulers here. King James says 10 mighty men. It's 10 rulers, 10 officials. It could just be a nice round number, 10. Other commentators have drawn comparison to a passage in Josephus's Antiquities that talks about 10 principal men who were sent as emissaries before Nero for the Jews in Jerusalem. Now, obviously, that is well after the time of Ecclesiastes, but some scholars have then suggested that this practice of having 10 representatives for a city may have dated back to the time of Qoheleth and been what he is referencing here. It's possible, we can't really know. Moving into verse 20. There is no one just that is righteous. That's what just means here. There is no one righteous on the earth who does good and doesn't sin. Also, take no heed to the words that are spoken, lest you hear your servant curse you. For often your own heart also knows that you likewise have cursed others. If we place verse 19 after verse 12, this verse flows more smoothly with the previous injunctions not to be too righteous or too wicked. Why bother trying to be the most righteous person around when we all have skeletons in the closet, hidden habits, and questionable motivations? The preachers are notorious for taking verses like this, verse 20, saying, there is no just person upon the earth who does good and doesn't sin, and saying, this means we're all sinners in need of a Savior. But remember, this is Old Testament. No one hearing this, read in Qoheleth's time, was thinking, yep, you know what, you're right. I have done bad things and I really need Jesus. Jewish theology wasn't looking, and still isn't looking, for a singular Savior to right our moral wrongs. This verse is not a statement of inherited sin from Adam or of humanity's need for salvation. Qoheleth's goal here is not to get you to repent and accept Jesus, or even Yahweh. He's simply pointing to the goody two-shoes of his day and declaring, you're not fooling me. You're not as good as you're trying to convince yourself you are. We are all messed up, and we all do messed up things to get ahead in life. Now, see, this verse should also be read in conjunction with the next few verses as well. When we learn about other people's offenses, particularly against us, we can be really quick to judge them and miss the similarities in how we ourselves often act as well. See, verse 21 isn't just telling you don't eavesdrop. It's actually saying don't be too quick to seek justice against someone else when you yourself have acted similarly in a different situation. See, this is kind of the message of a lot of the prophets toward the end of our Old Testament, where they talk about the coming day of the Lord and how the Israelites would have been excited about this because the day of the Lord means our enemies are getting punished and we end up back in the land. And God was saying, actually, the day of the Lord is just a day of justice coming, when God rights all wrongs. And notice the key word there, all wrongs. Not the wrongs of your enemies, all wrongs. Remember the quote from Jethani's book earlier today about the line between good and evil not running between you and me, but actually through each of us? We like to think, man, I can't wait for that person to get what's coming to them, and not realize that we ourselves have done the same thing and we just feel righteous right now because we didn't happen to be the one to do that today. We smirk a little bit when someone else gets pulled over by a cop for speeding, and we miss the times that we ourselves have done that and gotten away with it. We look down on someone else who gets caught in an affair, but forget about how we ourselves maybe have cut corners in a relationship up until then and just haven't gotten caught. See, we are so hard on other people when they get caught for the stuff that we do that we haven't yet gotten caught for. And so Qoheleth is saying, don't be too fast to pass judgment on someone else, because one day you might just be held accountable by that same judgment. Kind of sounds like something Jesus said of, don't judge lest you be judged by the same measure that you judge other people. That is a powerful statement for us to remember the next time that you're looking down on someone, making fun of someone, saying, oh, how could they? They're so stupid. Why would they do that? Okay, have you ever done something similar and just have gotten away with it? So you think you're better than them? None of us is quite as squeaky clean as we like to present on our social medias and in front of other people. Verse 23, Qoheleth says, I have proved all of this by wisdom. I said, I will be wise, but actually it was far from me. That which is far off and exceedingly deep, who can find it? At the end of the book, the frame narrator says, there is no end to writing books, and much study wearies the body. Honestly, I think he may have been drawing on Qoheleth's statements here. Dedicating your life to philosophical pursuits can wear you out physically just as much as a labor-intensive job. My 9-to-5 job is sitting at a computer as a mortgage processor, and I don't have any physical labor required for that aside from just moving my fingers on a keyboard. And yet I'm still exhausted at the end of a day just as much as if I went out and did lawn work all day or, something else. Mentally exhausting is also physically exhausting. I think that's because we are inherently both spiritual and physical creatures. You can't separate the two. They are inherently connected. So if you are worn out physically, you're probably going to be a little short-tempered emotionally or a little drained spiritually, and vice versa. One affects the other. Now, as we move into these last several verses, this really starts to get fun here. Before we get any further, I will point out that there is a possible chiasm in these last roughly 4 verses. This was pointed out in, this is quite a lovely title. It was an academic journal article. I'll actually link to it because it was really interesting. But it was called The Woman Who is a Snare, The Identity and Nature of the Female Figure in Ecclesiastes 7:25-29. Told you it was a mouthful of a title. But this is by Kyle C. Dunham, and I'll be drawing some on what he's talked about here because he has some really interesting insights. But we've talked about this before on the podcast, where a chiasm is a grammatical tool, expression, function, I don't know exactly what you would call it, but it's where you have one line, so you have like line A, line B, line C, and then it flips, it inverts. You have C prime, B prime, A prime. So the first and the last line match up, the second and the next to the last line match up, and then the 2 middle ones match up. And that's just going off of 3. It can be infinitely complex. It can go A through Z, if you want it to. But it's quite possible that setup is here in verses 25-29. It doesn't really transfer over well to describe it over audio, so I'll just put it in the show notes and you can check it out there. So let's just read verses 25-29 here, and you'll see why this is pretty controversial. This is actually one of the most misogynistic texts in the Old Testament, at least the way that's normally taken. The Bible is controversial when it comes to views on women, and usually we focus on Paul for those passages, but as far as the Old Testament goes, this one is one of the hardest to get around. But we are going to today because there is quite a bit of interesting material in these last few verses. Verse 25, I have applied my heart to know, and to search, and to seek out wisdom, and the reason of things, and to know the wickedness of folly, even of foolishness and madness. And I find more bitter than death the woman, whose heart is snares and nets, and her hand as bands. Whoso pleases God will escape from her, but the sinner will be taken by her. Behold, I have found this, says the preacher, counting one by one to find out the account, which yet my soul seeks, but I find not. 1 man among 1,000 have I found, but a woman among all those I have not found. Lo, this only have I found, that God has made man upright, but they have sought out many inventions. Okay, can you see how this could be a potentially thorny text? First off, I want to point out that for some reason, people read verse 26 and they think that he's talking about all women. He's not. They hear, I find more bitter than death, woman. But he doesn't say all women are better than death. He qualifies it, right? He says, I find more bitter than death the woman whose heart is snares and nets and her hands as bands. So he's talking about a specific kind of woman here. He's not saying all women. That's really important that we take this, because I have actually heard very misogynistic people I know who have used this verse to say that you just can't trust women and, guys are better, basically. Can I say this on the podcast? But bros before hoes is kind of the idea that they have. It doesn't work that way. You can't use this verse to defend your own misogynistic preferences. Qoheleth is saying that there is a specific type of woman who is a trickster, someone that you can't trust. He doesn't say all women, he's saying this particular type of person. But that still doesn't make things easier, because we still have to determine who this type of woman is. What does she stand for here in this passage? Does she stand for a large group of women in general? Does she stand for married women in general? That's a position some people take. Does she stand for foreign women, ones who weren't Jewish? Was this actually a woman he knows? Like, is this an ex of his that he's talking about? Is this a metaphorical woman, like we've talked about in Proverbs, where they have the Lady Wisdom and Dame Folly? Is this sort of a caricature of a personification of a characteristic or a trait? Which is it? Well, that is a question that people are debating, and it's really hard to tell just off of this. So we have to dig a little deeper, figure out some more of the context, and then we can circle back to this. Let's look at how he says that this woman is more bitter. That word bitter is the same root word that Naomi takes as a name when she feels that God has dealt bitterly with her in the book of Ruth. It's also the same root word that gave the place of bitter waters its name in Exodus, Marah. It's also used of the bitter water in Numbers 5, used to test a pregnancy. That is a very strange passage. That is an issue for another day, but I think it could possibly connect here, and it's important we point that out. It's also used, get this, in Proverbs 31 of giving wine to those who are bitter. It's interesting. Proverbs 5:3 has a similar statement to this, where he says, for the lips of a strange woman drop as a honeycomb, her mouth is smoother than oil, but her end is bitter as wormwood. Okay, so we start to see some parallels here. And if you listen to our first episode on this series, the Ecclesiastes stuff you don't know, I don't think that Qoheleth was Solomon. I think he may have been trying to play off of the Solomonic persona, but I don't think he himself was Solomon. However, it's possible that he was drawing on other works that were attributed to Solomon, like some of the Proverbs, in order to take on some of that perspective. So we see a lot of connections here between Ecclesiastes and Proverbs. I've talked about how in Proverbs you have this idea of the strange woman, the foreign woman who's trying to take you from the path of life. The description of her in Proverbs is strikingly similar to the description of this bitter woman in Ecclesiastes. We've already talked about how in Ecclesiastes she's described as bitter, and in Proverbs the strange woman is more bitter than wormwood. Both of them are compared to death. We have the word snares showing up, both in Ecclesiastes and in Proverbs 5:22, talking about this strange woman. We have her heart is nets in Ecclesiastes, and she is wily of heart in Proverbs. We have a description of her hands and arms in Ecclesiastes, and her eyes and mouth in Proverbs. We have the person who falls prey to her as a sinner in Ecclesiastes, and a description of her sin entangling someone in Proverbs. We have the person who is good before God escaping her in Ecclesiastes, and the person who is before the eyes of Yahweh in Proverbs. Wisdom delivers this person from her in Proverbs as well. Furthermore, you have the assembler, Qoheleth, warning about her here. And then in chapter 5 of Proverbs, the warning is applied in the midst of the assembly. Same word. Now, all these connections were drawn out by Dunham in that journal article that I mentioned earlier, so I will link to that in the show notes. Really, really interesting connections there that I think start to help us narrow down what exactly is going on with this bitter woman. It's not just women in general, and it's probably not just like some ex that he's still upset over, but it's actually talking about a specific type of person, a caricature, if you will, somebody who is a stand in for any sort of person, regardless of their sex, who is trying to draw you away from a way of life. Interestingly enough, there's similarities to Egyptian texts as well. There's an ancient Egyptian text called the Instruction of, I'm going to butcher this, but Tahotep is how I'll say it. It's Ptahhotep. This was actually written a couple thousand years before Ecclesiastes. See if you can catch some similarities here. If you desire to keep a friendship in the residence where you enter, as a master, as a brother, or as a friend, amongst whatever people you are, keep from approaching the women. The place where this is done cannot be good. The man who intrudes on them is imprudent. 1,000 men are turned away at their best interests. You see a similarity there to where Qoheleth says that he has looked among 1,000 people. All right. One is aroused by the limbs of Faience, but then she changes into carnelian, and that's talking about different bright colors. A brief moment like a dream, and death is reached by knowing them. It is a vile principle conceived by an enemy. One goes from doing it with the heart already spurning it. Don't do it. It is indeed an abomination, and you will be spared from a daily penalty. He who fails by lusting after them, no design of his will succeed. I definitely think that Egyptian text comes off a little more misogynistic than Qoheleth has to. But we also have to remember this was a very patriarchal culture. Most writing was done by men, and you often had areas for men to hang out and areas for women to hang out. You still see this in parts of the Middle East and other Eastern cultures today, right? I mean, I just think of when you have the Western Wall in Jerusalem, where you have a court for women and a court for men. It's just a common part of that culture. Now, we can disagree with it, but we also have to recognize that's the way things were back then and still are in some cultures. Now, other scholars have observed a similarity as well to the Egyptian papyrus Harris 500. And this is a piece of papyrus that has scraps of multiple stories on it. And one particular section of it says, "My beloved's mouth is a bud. Her breasts are apples of love." This is starting to sound like Song of Solomon, right? Her arms are, and that cuts off, it says, "Her brow is a spring snare of reeds, and I am the wild goose." That just made me laugh. This was referenced in Women and War in Qoheleth 723-81a. Again, what a lovely descriptive title, this time by Klaus Balzer. That's another one I'll link to in the show notes. But I can't get over the idea of this person saying, "I am a wild goose caught in her snare of reeds." I guess that's the origin of "I am the walrus," right? I am the wild goose. People don't change across thousands of years, right? But this is really interesting because it describes this woman's love as a trap, and this writer as the animal caught in the trap. So we have Qoheleth describing this woman in terms of a trap, but is that actually a bad thing to be caught in a trap of someone if you love them? I'm sorry, right now all I can think of is an Elvis song that includes a lyric about being caught in a trap. Going back to Baltzer's article, he notes some possible wordplay with military language and points out the dissonance between describing a woman's heart, or possibly even her breasts, depending on how you translate it, so that would be another connection to that Egyptian papyrus, and her hands with death. If anything, a woman's breasts actually provide life, not death. So maybe Qoheleth is actually reversing the language to play with our minds. Which then leads again to this question, is it actually a bad thing to be caught in a trap of love with a woman? This is the sort of thing that we have to think about and go, is this saying what it seems to be at face value? Remember at the very beginning how we talked about there are certain proverbs that Qoheleth will mention, and there's debate over, is he supporting these or is he putting them up for us to critique? So this could be his presenting these statements as is this actually as bad as people say that it is? Maybe it's not what it seems at first. And then, I mean, we also have to kind of consider, like, why is the woman here just cast as the one who is a trap? If she really is a trap and it's a negative thing, why isn't she told to change? Why is only the guy told to flee from her? And this is where we have to again recognize a patriarchal culture. And you can look at this from a couple of different ways. I mean, you could look at it a little more optimistically and say maybe it's putting the responsibility on the man and saying, you're responsible for what you do. Or, you could look at it a little more misogynistically and say maybe Qoheleth just was saying all women are out to get you. I mean, it is possible to read this as if it's saying the good man escapes from this woman, which is kind of sounds like what you say to a guy when he's about to get married, right? Like, oh my word, I remember one pastor who, whenever somebody would get engaged, his go-to line would immediately be, well, another good one bites the dust. And I realized he was joking, but there's a subtle misogyny in that. Well, maybe not so subtle. Maybe I should say an unconscious or subconscious misogyny built into that, where I'm just like, is that the healthiest joke to be making? I'm all for a good joke, and it can even be a little off color, and I still think it's okay, but it just feels like, is that the sort of thing that we should be saying? So maybe Qoheleth was taking a popular phrase, something like that, and playing it as ridiculous. I mean, he's taken everything else that we say and believe is common and taken it to an absurd end. So maybe he's putting this up in front of a mirror, if you will, so that we'll look at it from a different angle and say, oh, wow, maybe that's not as helpful to say as I thought it was. And I mean, if he's here talking about how she's more bitter than death and she leads to death, was he the fool that followed her? Is he actually speaking from experience here? I mean, in verse 27, it says, behold, I have found this, says the preacher, says Qoheleth. This is a rare third-person insertion in the book. He almost never steps in and speaks in third person and says, hey, Qoheleth says this. So some commentators think that this was actually added in later for emphasis because that doesn't match how he speaks in the rest of the book. Interestingly enough, though, others have translated it as a direct challenge to Qoheleth by the frame narrator or some third party. And they read it as, look at what I have found. Speak, Qoheleth. 1-to-1, find a conclusion. This is another case where it might help if you can actually see verse 27 in front of you. But it can be translated a different way. So rather than saying this is from Qoheleth's standpoint, it could actually be spoken to Qoheleth and saying, hey, I have found this to be true. What do you think about it? Weigh in. I want your opinion. And this is where we start to get into part of the translation difficulty with verse 28. Because verse 28 starts with just the word which. And if it's modifying the conclusion in the previous verse, what the King James says is account, it sounds like he's saying he found one good man amongst 1,000 people, but no women. But it can also be interpreted as the start of a new sentence, in which case it sounds like he's taking a common proverb and critiquing it as something that he has found to actually not be true. Yet again, this probably looks better if you can actually just see it in front of you. So I'd highly encourage you, if you don't have the ability to see your Bible in front of you right now, come back to this when you can. Because these are the two different ways you can read it. One way is to say, I have seen this, says Qoheleth, counting one by one or putting one thing against another to find the conclusion which my soul seeks, but I haven't been able to find it. In fact, amongst 1,000 people, I have only found one man, but not a single woman. That is the more traditional reading. That is the more misogynistic reading. However, you can actually take verse 27 as its own thing. And then you can take verse 28 as the start of something new. That which my soul seeks. But actually, I haven't found this to be true. One man among 1,000 have I found, but a woman amongst all those have I not found. So then this one man amongst 1,000 have I found and one woman have I not found becomes a popular phrase that he is critiquing. Not his own words, but something he's saying, I have searched this out. This is what my soul has sought. In other words, I have heard this and I've tried to prove it to be true, but he says, I found not. So, in other words, maybe this was a popular phrase in his day, and he tried to say, oh, is it true that there's only one good man amongst 1,000, but no women that you can find that are good? And you know what? I actually haven't found that to be true. Now, that really changes the meaning of the passage. You see why early on at the very beginning I said it would be important whether you think he's presenting traditional wisdom to follow or presenting traditional wisdom to critique, because that totally changes the meaning here. Now, I want to point out, though, something else very important. Depending on what translation you use, you might have some slightly different wording in verse 28, because some translations will say, I've only found one good man amongst 1,000, but I have not found a good woman amongst all those. Or others will say, one righteous man or one God-fearing man amongst 1,000 have I found, but no righteous or God-fearing women. But actually, those words aren't there. It's literally just one man among 1,000 have I found, but a woman among all those have I not found. So if your translation adds a word like good or righteous or God-fearing, that is an interpretive choice that is not in the text. And I think it actually obscures what is being said here, because then it leads us in that misogynistic direction, which could honestly just be a statement on the translator's own bias, their own hidden misogynism that's coming out here, because that's not what the text says. It just says he looked at 1,000 people, found one man, and no women. Well, what was he looking for? And it's not supplied in the text, so that can change a lot here. I mean, heck, he could have been looking for one thief amongst 1,000 people and found one man who was a thief, but no women who were. He could have been looking for a liar amongst 1,000 people and found one man who was a liar, but no women who were, right? So we assume so much here that isn't necessarily explicitly stated in the text. And furthermore, we don't even know exactly how many people he's saying he surveyed. Is he saying, I looked amongst 1,000 men and found one man? And I looked amongst 1,000 women, but couldn't find a woman? Or is he saying I looked amongst 1,000 people and found one man, but no woman? So did he look at 1,000 people, or did he look at 1,000 men and then 1,000 women? And since this is such a big round number, it's probably hyperbole in the first place and just a thought experiment. It's not necessarily saying he actually went out and polled 1,000 people. But this kind of changes the meaning a little bit. And then here's something else that changes the meaning even more. The word for man is Adam, or Adam, right? So it's just a word for human. It doesn't actually have to mean male humans. If he wanted to talk just about males, he could have said ish, but he said Adam. Now, when he uses the word for woman, he uses the word for woman, isha, but that word can also mean wife, and it totally depends on the context. So it's possible to read this verse as, I have found one human amongst 1,000, but I haven't found a wife in all of those. So in this case, maybe he found companionship in one true friend, but couldn't find someone that he wanted to marry. We should also point out, going back to the very first couple episodes, Qoheleth is a feminine word. Now, we talked about why I don't think Qoheleth was actually a female person, but the word itself is feminine in gender. So is Qoheleth including themselves in saying that they couldn't find a woman amongst these 1,000? That's something else to throw in. Some translators have also suggested that when he says that he found more bitter than death, the woman, that, as is a snare and so forth and so on, that word bitter can also be translated stronger. So he could have been saying, I have found stronger than death the woman who is a snare. So if we go with the idea that this is the strange woman of Proverbs, he could be saying that her way leads to death. She has ensnared many other people, but she seems to escape death herself. She seems to cheat death as it comes for each of her victims. But in his own experience, he finds that they all end up dying eventually, all these seductresses, and that actually sometimes one man is able to survive their wiles. That's possible. But we are not even close to done with these options. There's still a couple more to go here. Let's consider the Solomonic persona. How many wives and sex slaves, often called concubines, did Solomon reportedly have? 1,000. How many people did Qoheleth survey here? Possibly 1 or 2,000, but what if it's 1,000? So if you compare this to Solomon's reported 1,000 wives and sex slaves, is this then a sexual statement? In that case, is he actually saying that he has found more intimacy with one man than he did with those 1,000 women? Is he taking on the Solomonic persona and talking about his harem? That's really interesting. I mean, David said that he found the love of his friend Jonathan to be better than the love of women, and David was Solomon's father, so could this be a connection there? Could this be drawing on all of that to talk about an intimate relationship with a companion that he just couldn't find with all of these women? It's possible. Oh, but we are not done yet. Because another option arises when we consider that the word 1,000 can actually be a generic term for a company of soldiers. So some scholars actually think that Qoheleth is saying he did not find a single woman amongst 1,000 troops. You say, well, duh, I mean, most women didn't go to battle back then. So what's the point there? Well, remember that just a few verses earlier, we said that bitter could be translated stronger. I find stronger than death the woman. How is a woman stronger than death? Well, maybe because he couldn't find a single one in the camp of his soldiers. Maybe woman is stronger than death because she avoided war altogether. See, there are so many different possibilities you can go with this verse, and none of them have to be the misogynistic reading of, oh, Solomon hated women, that so many people seem to think. No, there's a lot of different possibilities here. Is he talking about a caricature of a woman like in Proverbs? Is he saying that she seemed to cheat death? Is he talking about women in the army? Is he talking about not being able to find intimacy with 1,000 wives in the Solomonic sense? Is he saying he wasn't able to find a wife, a woman to settle down with amongst all of these women, right? There are so many different ways you can look at it, and it still make sense. Oh, and one other thing to throw in with that military one, because I know that, at least for me, that view seemed like a little bit of a stretch at first. But then I realized that in verse 29, the very end, it says, look, this I have found. God has made humans upright, but they have sought out many inventions. And that word inventions is used only one other time in the Tanakh, which happens to be 2 Chronicles 26:15. And he made in Jerusalem engines invented by cunning men to be on the towers and upon the bulwarks to shoot arrows and great stones without. Now, that's not talking about engines like what you have in a car, but it's talking more about some sort of a siege machine, maybe something like a catapult, some sort of military weaponry. Well, couldn't that fit with the idea of a woman not being found in the army and that's why she's stronger than death because she escaped war? It could possibly all tie together. So it's a little bit of a mind bender, and it's one of those things that definitely makes us come back and rethink this from a different light. I don't think that we should take these verses in a misogynistic sense. I think we do have to be honest that the Bible was written in a patriarchal culture, and it's quite possible that the view that this author had of women is uncomfortable for us today. But I don't think that's what's coming across in this passage here. Now, I don't know exactly which one of these positions I would land on. To be honest, I had not heard of these until I actually studied it deeper. And this has just kind of blown my mind in the last few weeks as I've been mulling all of this over in my head. I don't know exactly what is intended here, but I don't think we have to take it in a negative sense against all women. In fact, I don't think we should take it that way. I think it's probably a caricature, kind of like we have in Proverbs with the foreign woman who's trying to take you from the way of Yahweh. And, that can be problematic in its own light. But I don't know, I kind of lean toward thinking that Qoheleth is here critiquing the popular phrase of his day, and we're assuming it's a popular phrase of his day. We don't know that for sure. But, if we take this view of it, it's quite possible that people went around saying, you can find one good man, but you're not going to find a woman to trust or to have as a wife, or, fill in the blank with however you want to translate that. And I think Qoheleth may have been pulling that up and saying, actually, I haven't found that to be true. And whichever position on this you take, I think it's okay to differ, but it's also important that we not use the Bible as a weapon against someone else just because of our own insecurities or our own misogyny or our own biases or whatever. Yes, the Bible is written in a patriarchal culture. Yes, there are things we may not entirely agree with, and we can debate over that, but we can't use that as an excuse to treat people poorly. There are always other ways of looking at a text. And I hope that by explaining some of these, you're able to look at it from a different light and meditate on this passage from a different set of perspectives than you've had before. And looking at this last verse, because we got to wrap up now, we've been going for a while. Qoheleth says, "This is the one thing I found. God has made man upright, but they've sought out many inventions." That word upright is actually the word for straight. And what he's saying is that nobody could help him find the answers. This is about seeking and not finding. God gave us a good start, but we've gone our own ways. We have followed in the footsteps of our ancestors, Adam and Eve, and their children, and we have often compounded things to make it worse. And so I think what he's actually saying here is don't blame God for when things go wrong. And in light of these last few verses, he might even be saying, don't blame God if you can't find what you consider to be a good woman. Maybe you should look at yourself instead of everybody else. Maybe if you can't find a girl, the problem is with you. And again, this is a patriarchal setting here. But if he only looked at 1,000 men and couldn't find a woman, that's another way you could look at it is, well, maybe the problem is he looked at 1,000 men, and that's why he couldn't find any women. He needed to actually go where the women were and talk to them, right? Isn't it so typical of men to tell everybody what is true for everyone and to not listen to women? Oh, we do that so much in our churches. And for any women listening, I am so sorry that we have used and abused the Bible in order to use and abuse you. You are God's children just as much as we are. You have as much worth, dignity, value, and place, not just in God's family, but also in his churches, in gatherings, in Christian leadership as any of us, and sometimes more so than many of us. So I don't think that we should be using these texts to silence women and to keep them down. And realize this is a much bigger discussion than we have time for right now. But I think Qoheleth may have even been leaning into this idea to say, God made humanity the way it was supposed to be. And if we've messed it up, that's our own fault. And maybe there's even a little bit of a subtext of part of why we've messed up is because we haven't listened to other people who are a little bit different than us. Be that a different sex, a different gender, a different race, a different ethnicity, fill in the blank. Maybe the reason we can't find what we're looking for is because we've been telling other people the way they need to be instead of listening to them as they are. And I love Shapiro's translation of this verse to finish it out. What I did find was this: reality is simple, but we insist on complicating it. This chapter has been all about finding a middle way between extremes. Don't stress yourself out trying to be the most churchy person out there, but also don't try to game the system by cutting corners. And when other people do wrong, remember that you do too, and maybe take it a little easy on them. Some things will always be beyond our comprehension. That doesn't mean that we should stop trying to figure them out, but just know the exhausting pursuit that you're getting yourself into. And finally, it's hard but not impossible to be honest and intimate with people, but it's worth the effort if you're willing to go above and beyond what most people do. I want to say thank you all to listening through this episode. We went with something a little bit different here. Normally, we would break up an episode like this. We try to keep our episodes around an hour, no more than an hour and a half. But I know there are multiple podcasts out there that go longer, 2.5, 3, sometimes 3.5 hours long. And there are different people out there. Some of you think a long podcast episode is 3 hours long. Some of you think a long podcast episode is 25 minutes long. So I want to see what this was like for you. This was a lengthy chapter, is the longest in Ecclesiastes, and obviously there was a lot to cover. And I wanted to keep it all in one, and we've never done an episode this long before, so I would love to hear back from you. Please write in, let us know, comment on our socials. Is this too long for you? Are you okay with this? And, maybe you just broke it up as you needed to listen. Would you have preferred if we broke it in half? Or do you like when it's a little bit longer? I promise we are not going to have most of our episodes this length. We're going to try to keep them around the normal length. But it's an experiment, and I'd love to hear from you if you are okay with this every once in a while, or if you'd prefer we break it up into just part one, part two sort of thing. So let us know. Also, one other thing I want to give you a heads up on here that we are super excited about. This is going to be coming up in about a month here. We're looking to do this in July. I'm thinking it's probably going to be on Friday, July 5th in the evening, probably somewhere right around 6:30, maybe 7 o'clock p.m. We are going to do a group watch party. There is a movie that I grew up watching as a kid. It was produced by Bob Jones University, and it's called Sheffy. It's about the life of a traveling preacher from, I think it was around the turn of the 1900s. And I remember really liking it as a kid, but it came up not that long ago in conversation with somebody else, and I started rethinking through it and realizing there are actually some really problematic things in that movie. And I have not seen it in years. I would love to rewatch it, and I would love for some of you to rewatch it with us so we can comment as we go along, see what has held up and what parts maybe didn't age so well. We'll have some dialogue about it, have a fun time. We're going to have it up on Zoom, so if you are interested, write into us, comment on our socials, whatever, just let us know that you are interested in doing this with us. We will post a Zoom link for that for the time. It is on YouTube, so it's something that you can have free to watch. It's right there free on YouTube. You don't have to pay for it. And we'll just set a time where we're able to start it together, watch through it together, comment on it. It should be a really fun time. I am actually super excited for that, and just doing that as part of the 4th of July long weekend, hopefully, that people will have. So if you're interested, let us know in that. We'll continue putting out on socials and give you some more info as time comes closer, but just wanted to give you that heads up since we are about a month out. Next week, we will be back in Ecclesiastes, going with chapter 8. It is a much shorter chapter than we had this week, so don't worry, the episode will be shorter as well. Until then, stay curious and keep asking questions about the Uncut and Unfiltered Bible. You've been listening to the Bible Uncut and Unfiltered. We hope we provided a healing place to discuss the questions you can't ask and the context you won't learn in church. If you enjoyed the podcast, would you take a minute to share it with a friend? You could also rate and review on your podcast app. If you'd like to donate to keep our work going, you can go to our website, thebibleuncut.com, and click on the Support Us tab. While you're there, check out the recommended resources and blog where we post show notes and other articles. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next week.